I'd like to call to order the special meeting of the Planning and Zoning Board for the Village of Pinehurst for September 6, 2022. I am Jeremy Hooper, and I'll be chairing the meeting tonight. I will point out that we have a full board with us. All 9 members are present, and that constitutes a quorum, and we're able to conduct business. Let's have each of the board members introduce themselves, beginning with Paul Roberts.
Paul Roberts.
Philip Shoemaker.
David Almazora.
Jack Farrell.
Julia Latham.
Matt Jones.
Sonia Rothstein.
And joining us tonight from the Village of Pinehurst is Darren Burrich and Alex Cameron, I believe, as well.
He's on route.
Okay,
En route.
he's en route. So at this point in time, I'll go ahead and remind everyone, the board members at least, to please speak directly and clearly into your microphones tonight, as we are being audio taped, videotaped, and live streamed. We're also not going to take public comments tonight. We thank everybody for being with us. We had over 300 in attendance on Thursday evening with over 50 public comments received. So thank everybody very much. And we will be following the agenda as in order tonight. And the first agenda item is general business. Agenda item A will be the review of neighborhood quality of life survey results. Darren?
I'm muted. So before that, we were going to go into the general recap. We had the public hearing on last Thursday. I think we had over, 300 people in attendance. I think another 173 or so online. I think we took 50 general comments from the public, and we started to enter into some deliberations and discussion on the proposed amendments. Tonight, the goal really of tonight is to, because of the lateness of the hour and we're all kind of exhausted, we weren't really able to get into the mechanics of the proposed amendments. That is the goal tonight, is to go through the proposed amendments section by section and start going through that, so we can at some point forward that recommendation up to the council based on the proposed amendments before you. I think at that meeting we had talked of separating out homestays at least working on the short-term rentals, getting that done ahead of time, then moving back potentially to the homestays, because the short-term rental is really the priority, has been the priority policy direction that we've been given on this. So we were going to go that route first. With that said, what we didn't do last time, and we meant to get around to it, is that you can recall that a lot of the work that we were doing was based on, or not based on, but part of our work effort was that quality of life survey. And we just want to go over a brief presentation on that quality of life survey. It's the same presentation that we dealt with, that was provided to the council. So Matt McCurahan is here to come on up and give us a short presentation, 15 minutes or so. And the goal of tonight's meeting is to get us out of here 6-ish. So
We're hopeful. Thank you.
6:30.
Matt, welcome. Welcome to the meeting.
Thank you all so much. Matt McCarahan, I'm the Organizational Performance Director here in the Village of Pinehurst. I believe it's my first time being with you all, so thank you all for letting me join. A little bit of pressure from Darren, about 15 minutes or less. I promise I will move through it as fast as possible. However, if you have any questions for me, please let me know. If it's possible, Darren, could you go ahead and pop up the PowerPoint presentation? We may. It is. I now have 13 and a half minutes to go through the presentation. So as Darren said, this is actually a...
Hey, Matt, I'm sorry, so sorry to interrupt.
Of course.
We have one of the monitors out. Are you guys able
Which
to
one?
see
Yours?
behind us? Okay. Okay, I think they're able to see behind us. Go ahead.
We'll work on that.
Please continue. Sorry to
No,
interrupt.
absolutely. So as Darren stated, this is actually a review of the presentation that has previously been given to council. In fact, the only thing that's different is the first slide here to update the date. So I'm going to go through it. A lot of it's probably going to be just a refresher for you all. However, if you have any questions or concerns, please let me know. I'm happy to stop during it. And there's a little bit of a lag, so we'll see what we can do here. So just again, as a reminder, we use ETC Institute for this survey. This is the same survey partner that we've used for years for our community and business survey. They are one of the top survey partners in the country when it comes to local government surveys. As you can see on the screen, they've done more than 2 million persons since 2010 in more than 900 communities in 49 out of the 50 states. Have not yet found out which one is the number 50. And as an aside, as you saw on the last screen, the business and community surveys are what we use again every year with them, and they are currently out in the field. So a quick reminder on the methodology. We sent out approximately 4,000 surveys via a postcard and a QR code that was linked to an address, a residence within the village of Pinehurst, and it was distributed on a population sample. So in regards to geographic dispersion, age, gender, and race and ethnicity. We got more than 350, the goal was to get more than 350 completed. We ended up getting 401 survey responses. And it was out for approximately 2 weeks in between the end of June and the beginning of July. Again, as I mentioned, 401 verified responses, which means that the address that was put at the end of the survey matched the postcard address that was sent out to it so that we have a representative population sample. Margin of error is plus or minus 4.8% at 95% confidence. One of the elements that you're going to see in this presentation is both a visual presentation of the results, but then also ETC worked with us to provide a statistical significance response to the question of the impact of short-term rentals to the perceived issues that were a part of the neighborhood survey. So we're going to walk through each one of those. And again, if you have questions, let me know. But however, I will state just as a general reference, and I'll repeat this later, when you get to those slides, you're going to see the results in a tabular format, and you're going to see uppercase letters and lowercase letters. The answer to that is if you see an uppercase letter, it is a 99% probability that there is an actual difference between that answer that you see, let's say it's 95%, and the uppercase letter that is underneath it. So, if it's letter D is 95% and there's an uppercase A below it, you're going to see that that's saying there's a 99% probability that there is a difference between that response and the response in A. When you see a lowercase letter, it's going to be a 95%. So it's another way of saying that there is either a 5%, for the uppercase letter, there is a 1% chance that it is due to random chance that there is of the responses, and then for the lowercase that there is a 5% chance of randomness when it came to those responses. Going into the general results here, we had 372 responses out of the 401 that marked single-family residence, 24 that said multifamily, and 3 that were mixed use. Now, because of the low numbers of multifamily and mixed use, we made a decision to segment out that information from those two and focus specifically on single-family residences. Because again, at such a small response rate, it's very hard to draw any real conclusions from those. Now, overall quality of life, as you can see, 95% of all respondents selected either good or excellent when rating their quality of life. As you can see here, I believe it's 60% stated excellent and 35% stated good. When we break that down a little bit further, now looking at specifically single-family versus multifamily and mixed use, 94% of those single-family resident responses, again, the ones that we're focusing on for the majority of this presentation, selected either good or excellent. Now, when we segment it down based off of proximity to short-term rentals, and one of the things I want to bring to your attention, the question that we asked was approximately how many, and I'm paraphrasing here, but it's approximately how many short-term rentals are within a 2-minute walk of your front door. Now, the rationale for that is that trying to find a way to capture a 2-minute walk from a person on a single-family lot and, with homes beside them versus those that live in townhomes versus those that live in condos or apartment complexes. 2 minutes can be up, down, left, and right, depending on where you live. We thought that was a way in order to try to even the playing field about when it comes to proximity of issues around you, that we could try to set the stage for that 2-minute walk. Now, everybody we know walks different paces at 2 minutes, and that's some of those questions have also come up as well. So looking at this survey, the way we segmented it down here by quality of life, those that said that there were no perceived vacation or short-term rentals within that 2-minute walk or that proximity, 76% of them rated their quality of life as excellent. But by comparison, one rental property was at 60%, 2 rentals were at 63%, and 3 or more was at 47%. Now, those that said don't know was at 56%.
So these were all self-reported, so
Yes, these are perceptions.
it's what people, so they don't know if they actually live next to a short-term rental or not.
Yes, that is yeah, absolutely. You are correct. It is perceived number of short-term rentals within a 2-minute walk. That is correct. Yes, exactly. So, and again, there are more points on here as well, but for the sake of time, I'll just quickly go through, and if you have questions, let me know. Now, when we're looking at overall quality of life, just to orient you to this tabulation here, this is what we talked about before when it came to significance. I will state that one of the pet peeves of mine is reading off of a slide. Unfortunately, this is going to be one of those moments where I'm going to have to read off of a slide a little bit because it's just a little bit nuanced. I want to make sure we get it correct. So there's a 99% probability, according to these results, that there's an actual difference between those that said that there were 3 or more vacation/short-term rentals within their proximity of their front door, compared to those with none. As you can see, it is 46.8% compared to 76.2%. Of those choosing good, there is a 95% probability, again, those lowercase letters, that there is an actual difference between those that have 3 or more vacation short-term rentals within proximity compared to those with none. Again, that is 38% compared to 23.8%. Now we're going to jump into some of these higher level questions. Here we did ask respondents to outline the overall factors that impact quality of life within their neighborhoods. We found that there were 5 that rated that over 90% of respondents feel are either very important or important. You can see those on your screen. The top one is safety, then a quiet and peaceful setting, followed by housing aesthetics, community services, and then walkable streets. But we also know that when it comes to asking questions about quality of life impact, that, depending on, a lot of people could rate that all of them are incredibly important. So we then said, okay, let's take that one step further and say, what are the top 4 factors? If you had to rank them, what are those top 4 factors that impact your quality of life? And there were 3 of them that got 50% or more of the responses. The top one being safety at 88%, followed by quiet, peaceful setting at 77%, and then walkable streets ended up in 3rd at 62%. Here's that the cross-tabular results compared to that question again around those which 4 factors are most important. Again, there's a 99% of those selecting knowing your neighbors, which is an option there, which again, during this conversation, there's been a lot of conversation about knowing your neighbors. There's a 99% probability of an actual difference between respondents that selected 3 or more compared to none. And that was a 48.9% compared to 28.6%. And then of those selecting a quiet, peaceful setting, we saw that there was a 95% probability of an actual difference between those with 1 or 2 precede vacation short-term rentals compared to those with both none and 3 or more. And I thought that was actually a pretty interesting response.
Matt, sorry.
sir.
I know you've got this on a few different slides, but just to make sure, because you're moving through the statistics,
Yes.
can you explain in a different way what those bullets mean?
Yes, so when you're looking at significance, what you're trying to understand is whether or not, in this case, whether or not you were trying to, whether or not the results are up to random chance. And so what this is saying is that there is a 95% probability that there is an actual difference for those small letters, of an actual difference between the responses of one group compared to the response of the other group, right? Or there's another way, there's less than 5% chance that these results came randomly. So, and I know it's a little bit difficult. So for instance, just drawing your eye to it, if you look at knowing your neighbors up there, there's an uppercase A below 48.9%. That's saying that there is a 99% probability that these results are not by random chance. The difference when it comes to the 48.9% compared to letter A, which is none at 28.6%.
Matt, can you help me understand? Like for quiet, peaceful setting,
Yes.
are these people saying that a quiet, peaceful setting is particularly important to them? Or are these people saying, I have a good and excellent, quiet, peaceful setting?
What this slide in particular is saying, that there is a statistically significant difference between those who stated 1 or 2 short-term rentals within their proximity and those that both chose none and 3.
Oh, no, I understand that.
Oh, okay. Sorry,
What
I
is the
apologize.
question about the quiet, peaceful setting? Are they saying, I have a quiet, peaceful setting? Or are they saying a quiet, peaceful setting is particularly important to me?
So these are about factors that are important to them.
Okay.
Yes.
So the fact that something is important to them may or may not, well, you were saying there is a statistical significance about that being important to them and there being a short-term rental near them. You aren't telling me causation, though.
Yes, that is correct.
Got it.
Yes, and that's an important point as well. It is not stating, and I'd be very clear about this, it is not necessarily stating, and when we get into the results here as well, that there is, let's just make an example here when we talk about improper placement of waste receptacles. We're not stating that the short-term rental that is within a 2-minute walk of there is the one that is doing so, right? What we are stating is that of those people who chose that there is a short-term rental within proximity, there is potentially, and I'm making this part up, a potential impact of frequency around improper placement of waste receptacles. Like when we get to that, like I said, to get to that point, I think that it's, so there, that to your point, that is correct. We're not stating specifically that it is, this house over here, right? Kind of point.
But that could be somebody walking around and saying, well, these trash cans are out every time. There's no way somebody who would live in Pinehurst would leave their trash cans out this long every week. It's got to be a short-term rental. That could be an assumption that they're making.
So that's, again, there are probably a myriad of assumptions. Yes.
You mentioned the,
Oh, sorry. I can go back.
no, you're fine. You mentioned the randomness, the probability of certainness versus randomness. Could you go into that a little bit? Just help me understand. You're saying that you get a 99% chance that it's not random, or 95% chance that it's not random. Could you elaborate on that?
Yes, so in general, and I think it'll become clearer when we get to the issues that are on the next couple of slides here. But essentially, it's saying that actually, if it's okay, may I, if I move on to the next one, I can use,
Yeah,
I think
sure.
the next one will be a little bit easier just to clarify for our purposes here. And I'm going to skip ahead. I promise I'll go back. So for instance, if we're looking at the improper placement of waste receptacles, this is talking about how frequently have you observed the following in your neighborhood, right? What it is not saying is, so at the 99% probability that there's an actual difference between those that received, those with no perceived vacation short-term rentals compared to those with 3 or more, we know, based off of the statistical significance, that it's basically saying that there's a 99% chance that the lower number of around 3 or more that chose rarely is due to random chance when compared to those that said none, which is, stating that there is a difference between those two categories. Now, for the most part, when we're looking at these, we're looking at frequently or somewhat frequently. So the next bullet that says, of those that are choosing somewhat frequently, that there's a 95% probability of an actual difference between none and those with 3 or more. What we're saying is that it is not random chance that there is a difference between those that stated somewhat frequently I see issues around improper waste receptacles, all right, at 0 compared to those that say 3 or more. Does that help to clarify? Now, and again, it is on each individual question and each individual selection that is available. I'm going to step back here just real quick just to provide the clarification. We'll go through each one of these really quick as well. Is that we did ask a series of questions about observed issues and the frequency of observed issues within your neighborhood. And as you just saw, we did cross-tab those results with those who chose the different options between the proximity of short-term rentals. So overall, those at 23% or more of all single-family neighborhood responses, regardless of vacation short-term rental choice, reported never having an issue with the improper placement of waste receptacles, and I think that that's important to note. All right, a majority, another way of saying a majority, responded that they never or rarely observed this issue. Now, of those that did identify short-term rentals, it did tend to increase, frequency tended to increase as the number of short-term rentals increased. As you can see on the screen, just to orient yourself when you're looking at the orange, I think it's kind of orangish and then brownish on your screen there. It's the bottom 2 and 3 before you get to the notch shorts. And the largest percentage of frequency was single-family responses identifying 3 or more at 33%. 24% said somewhat frequency and 9% said frequently. We did go through this. Again, I'm happy to repeat it. If not, I can move forward. So next, we looked at problems with noisy neighbors. And in fact, I've got to go back one page. All right, so of those who identified, overall frequency of problems with noisy neighbors did increase as the number of vacation and short-term rentals increased. Now, a majority of responses choosing no vacations, short-term rentals, or were not sure reported never having an issue. So majority, obviously. And then of those respondents who identified some, at least one or more, of a short-term rental within their proximity, choices of never significantly increased from 58% that chose none to 29% of 3 or more. Significantly decreased, I apologize.
You may have said, what is the N of the 3 or more sample?
The 3 or more sample N, and I have it here in 1 second. Apologize, it's on a previous page.
Sure, sorry.
So those that chose 3 or more out of the 372, there were 78. Of 2, there were 49. Those that chose 1 was 53. Those stating none were 79. And then those that stated don't know was 113.
Thanks.
Right, similar cross-tabular result that we've seen. Again, drawing your eye specifically to frequently and somewhat frequently here, again, just for purposes of conversation. Those that responded frequently, we saw that there was a 99% probability that there was an actual difference between those that said 3 or more within proximity compared to all other options. So as you can see, in this case, when it came to noisy neighbors, the frequency, those that said frequently was 17% for 3 or more, and then those that chose 2 or less were 2% and less. Somewhat frequently, we saw at 95% probability 2 or more, so again, that's C and D, compared to those that stated somewhat frequently for none. Looking at RVs and boats and other oversized vehicles. 22% of respondents who chose 3 or more observed issues of oversized vehicles at least somewhat frequently, compared to 1% to those reporting no vacation or short-term rentals. 4 of the 5 categories received at least 50% or more responses of never. So again, just as a baseline for the conversation. The one exception, though, was respondents who reported 3 or more vacation or short-term rentals at 42%. As the number of observed rentals increased, we did see that there was a general shift from never to somewhat frequently and frequently, right? So we started to see that shift go up to those higher somewhat frequently to frequently in general as you went up the number. Now looking at the statistical significance of this, those that chose frequently, we know that there's a 99% probability that there's an actual difference. Those that chose none compared to those with 3 or more. So as you can see, 11.7% compared to 0%. And then somewhat frequently that there's a 95% probability that there's an actual difference between those with 1 or more within their proximity. So as you can see on the screen, those are 9%, 9.8%, I believe 7.4 compared to those with none. Parking in the right-of-way. A majority, in this case, stated that they never or rarely observed an issue with parking on the right-of-way. 9% of those respondents who identified no short-term rentals selected at least somewhat frequently for parking in the right-of-way, which is significantly lower compared to the 21% for 1 rental, 26% for 2 rentals, and 38% for 3 or more. Of those reporting problems within the right-of-way, we saw significantly more frequent for respondents who reported at least 1 short-term rental compared to those that saw none. And of those reported problems, they were less substantial when comparing between respondents who reported 1, 2, 3 or more short-term rentals. Looking at the right-of-way, again, as a statistical significance, sorry. Those who chose frequently, 99% probability that there is an actual difference between those that chose no vacation / short-term rentals compared to those with 3 or more. Again, you can see 2.4 to 13.8. And those choosing somewhat frequently, we also saw a 99% probability that there is an actual difference between those that chose no vacation or short-term rentals compared to those with 2 or more. So again, that's 6% compared to greater than or equal to 21.6%. I know I'm throwing a lot of numbers at you all. If you have, like I said, if you have any questions, please feel free to interrupt. Now, moving on. Now, as we're going through this, we're also starting to see more and more nevers going into it. So, drug use and public intoxication reported issues around drug use and public intoxication were nearly non-existent for respondents who reported no vacation or short-term rentals. In their home, 89% reported never compared to, and 99% reported rarely. I'm going to slow down there. And then reported problems were more frequent, though, for those with 2 or 3 or more in proximity to their home compared to those with none. So as you can see, I used here none, said somewhat frequently, or frequently at 1% compared to 10% at 2 or 14% at 3 or more. Looking at the statistical significance slide here, we saw that, actually going to go to the second bullet first because I like starting at frequently. Respondents choosing frequently, we saw that there's a 95% probability that there's a difference between those that chose none compared to those that saw 3 or more. Again, those are small numbers at 0% compared to 5.3%, but it is a statistically significant difference. And we saw a 99% probability that those who chose somewhat frequently when looking at those that chose no vacation short-term rentals compared to those that chose 3 or more at 1.2% compared to 10.6%. And then trespassing, it was a less observable issue compared to the previous problems to date. Over 80% said that they never or rarely observed trespassing. And those 12% who identified 3 or more within their proximity stated that they observed it somewhat frequently or frequently. So you can see 6% in both somewhat frequently or frequently. Those were the 2 highest that were a part of the respondents. And then, again, just as a general statement, we did start to see that responses generally did migrate from never to rarely as the number of vacational short-term rentals increased. We are almost at the end, I promise. So the only one here that was drawn that was statistically significant was at a 95% probability between those that had no vacational short-term rentals compared to those with 3 or more within their proximity. And again, that was at 0 to 5.3% that we saw on the previous slide. And then finally, we asked the question about frequency of prostitution, and we identified that it was not identified as a significant problem regardless of the proximity of vacation or short-term rentals. And as you can see here, the only statistically significant difference, I've been saying that too much today, was found in the category of never. Or, and again, not sure. So in general, that is the overview that we presented to council when the survey results were done. I'm happy to try to answer any questions that you have about the survey or the results that you've seen today.
Questions, anyone?
So the general trend, I guess, is that people who have more problems in their neighborhood perceive that there are more short-term rentals there, but there's nothing actually documenting any responses that the problems were caused by short-term rentals, nothing showing that trash receptacles that have left out are owned by somebody who owns a short-term rental or anything like that.
So when it comes to the survey, the way I would say it is that the responses showed where there are differences that we talked about. There is, in some cases, statistically significant difference on the frequency of perceived issues compared to the perceived number of short-term rentals within a 2-minute walk of their front door.
But it's all, there's nothing showing or documenting that any short-term rentals exist within a 2-minute walk of any of these respondents' homes.
Yeah, I apologize, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, you're fine.
So this survey is only asking for perception of those.
Any other questions? I will point out, though, as a board, I think that this information as given to us and how we utilize it, it's not necessarily our role to qualify it further or defunct it. It's definitely information that we can use, certainly as we measure our end result against the 2019 comprehensive plan. I think it's good information. But I just want to mention that as well. So please go ahead.
Makes me wish I paid more attention in statistics class. Can you speak to the category of don't knows, because that's a significant number? Like, would you say, how much does that affect the reliability of the none through 3 or more, like the people who perceived STRs close to them? Because that don't know is such a large group, I mean, does it, basically, does that comparison make a difference, or
So where,
the others?
don't know is a statistically significant difference compared to the other options, those are provided within those slides as well. So again, we use don't know. Don't know is normally in surveys, you have, I don't know how I'm going to respond to this, so I choose don't know. We kept don't know in here because we believe that that's a perfectly valid response, right? It's a perception of, I don't know how many short-term rentals are within a 2-minute walk of my front door. And so that's why we use those responses as well within the cross-tabulation when it came to significance. Now, that, I don't know if I'm necessarily answering your question, so correct me if I'm wrong, but I just think that's why it's involved there, because in and of itself, that is a response just as valid as somebody who perceived 1 and those who perceived 0. It's the same thing as perceiving, I don't know, is also a valid response within those categories. So that's why it's reliable in the sense that it's built in within those options. I think, yes, I think that's.
Yeah, I think
the best way to
that's
put it.
helpful. It's almost like don't know is a survey within itself, because it's as if you did the survey and it wasn't about STRs at all, because those are people that are saying, I don't know, but I'm going to answer this question regardless of what is present.
Bill?
Yeah, and if I missed this in the data, sorry, how many did you send out total? I saw the goal was 4,000.
Sorry, I need to speak up closer to the mic. We sent out approximately 4,000. Yes.
Okay.
I believe the number was right at 4,000, if I had to guess.
How do we choose the time of the year that we send out these surveys?
So this is the first year that we've done a neighborhood quality of life survey. And so this was a one-off survey because of, at the time, we wanted to better understand the quality of life issues that were before us. In general, when it comes to the business and the community surveys, that's been on an annual basis, and I can be wrong about this, but for at least my perception of why we send them out at the time that we do is, one, consistency for what we've done in the past, but then also the ability for us to be able to turn that information around to help us better understand the community when it comes to going into our annual retreats for setting village and council priorities, which really start in November. And by the time we get the results back for the annual business and community surveys, those come back in October so that we present them to council. And then from there, we roll those responses going into November in those conversations.
Anything else?
Is there any way to track, aside from what's self-reported on the responses, where the data is actually coming from?
Can you clarify?
I could be a vacationer who received some sort of mail notice at the short-term rental that I was staying at and responded to the survey. It's not necessarily a neighboring property owner, or there's nothing to confirm who's actually responding.
The postcards went to the physical residential address that is within the village of Pinehurst.
And I'm not, again, this isn't a cross-examination. I'm not,
No,
don't think, I'm just asking for my knowledge, because I'm
and let me be clear as well. I apologize. When I say physical addresses, what I mean is that those residential addresses. So not necessarily those residential addresses that are associated with the village of Pinehurst.
So at the census in 2020, we had 7,301 households, 7,301 households. It went out to 4,000, so a little over 50%, so 54.9%. And we got 401 back. So not a huge response, I mean, representing the entire community, in my opinion. But do you or do we collect demographics data as well on that? Like, are you able to, I'm not asking you for it, but are you able to put together, say, heat maps? Like, could you tell where, say, one portion of the community is responding more than other portions of the community and determine if there's any, maybe there's a housing association that's all getting together, or maybe it went to a community that is like Pinehurst Trace, which is 55 up. I mean, is there a way to tell that maybe those smaller communities that may have a little more flexibility in their time to respond, or whatever the case is, maybe the answers are coming from them?
So that's a good question. So I'll answer it a couple of different ways.
Yeah, certainly.
So when we partner with ETC, they use multiple different demographic categories to ensure that the sample in which that goes out and that we receive is representative of the community. Now, that goes to geographic dispersion, again, to neighborhoods. It goes to age, race, ethnicity, age, as well as some other categories. Now, during that conversation, when those responses come in, we're in contact with them to make sure that the results that we are seeing is, in general, representative of the village as a whole. Now, I did not provide it within this. I provided a slide when I presented with council a different presentation. The survey, the Neighborhood Quality of Life survey, very closely, and in some cases, exactly match percentage-wise compared to the responses that we received from our annual community survey last year, from a neighborhood-by-neighborhood response. And so if we see, or if ETC sees that there is a large contingency within one neighborhood that is outside of the representation that we have seen historically in the past when it comes to our other surveys, they will take steps to try to get other responses from either communities that are underperforming, or mostly communities as well as other demographic information of underperforming groups, to make sure that it is a representative sample.
Thank you. Is that a representative sample from a percentage standpoint?
5.5% by household. By population, it's less, it's about 2.01%. So we're talking for an hour about 401 responses that we don't know the accuracy on.
So my one caveat is,
Done a great job. That is
I know,
not
I
a slam
know.
on you.
No, but-
You did an awesome job.
just for caveat, this survey is, the results, as we stated earlier, we're 95% confident within I believe it's a 4.8%, which means 4.8% above, as well as a 4.8% below, plus or minus margin of error. So I believe it was 4.8%. I just want to make sure yes, the original was plus or minus 5.5%, and we received it at plus or minus 4.8%. Again, and that's partly to the point of the number of that you received back relative to the population in which you were sampling.
So to sum it up, of the 5.5% of the households that responded, it appears as though they're not in favor of short-term rentals near them.
That is, I am not in a position to make that
Okay.
statement.
He's not drawing any conclusion.
Or are there any other questions to Matt? Hearing no questions, Matt, I think I'm going to assume that most of our board members did view your presentation to council, so we appreciate this as a review to us, is the way I'm going to take this. So with no other questions, thank you
Thank you.
very much.
Appreciate it.
Thanks, Matt.
And can you pull that down?
Thanks.
So let's welcome back Darren as we move to get into the proposed amendment discussions where we're going to review each separate issue. Darren?
Sure. Shannon's pulling that down right now. And I know Shannon also printed out some of the copies of some of the comments that have been made to share, so I fully expect us to discuss some of that as we're going forward. So I think for tonight's purposes, I'd like to kind of move from what I think are some of the easier ones to handle, revocation, which is a general one, to the to at least one definition, and then the SRs, and then to table 8.51A, if that's acceptable, or do you have any other recommendations as a group, which way you would like to go?
I'd like to say, obviously, we have to parse it out to discuss it. I was thinking about it on the way over, and I would appreciate it if we tabled motions to accept or not accept until the end so we can look at all of it together, because I feel like these things are very interrelated. And while we might be able to come to an agreement perhaps on the definition of short-term rental, our discussion about the permitting process may lead to a realization that we want to go back and look at that definition again. And if we've already taken and accepted a motion on that, then it becomes a more difficult task to reopen something that we've already decided. So just for me, for my way of thinking about doing this, I have no problem with breaking up by section for our discussion, but I'd like to hold any final motions on acceptance till we've got everything thoroughly discussed, and then we go, so we can look at it in a totality. Just my thought.
I think that was part of my expectation as well, so I guess the question would be, does any board member feel different than that? If they don't, then, Jack?
No, I don't feel different. However, we should point out that we did make a motion and pass a motion relative to homestays the other night, which separated that particular aspect of the question. And I think that still stands. Is that correct, Darren?
That's correct.
Okay.
I think we recognize that. Okay.
Jeremy, may I, since I was specifically called out in one of the public emails, can I address that?
I would, not at this point in time, maybe in your comments. I mean, I would, if it's a personal response to anyone who has pointed you out.
It's not to
specific-
somebody, but I think in the relation of conflict of interest, I should probably state it publicly.
Are you willing to state a conflict of interest or anything?
No, I just wanted to state that I do not own nor have any financial gain or brokerage or management of any short-term rentals within the village of Pinehurst, despite the, court of public opinion. I have none. So.
Thank you for-
Just wanted to put that on the record.
Thank you for clearing that. I think when we asked for any sort of conflicts of interest when we initially started, we took it as that. So thank you for that clarification. Darren?
All right, so what I'd like to start with is section 4.2.12, which is currently up on the screen, revocation of the development permit. And as we've discussed before, we don't have a process. We actually refer to revocation of permits within the PDO, but we don't have a process set up for that. So, as part of this discussion, where we're going down the route of requiring a development permit, we started to look at some of the options with respect to revoking a development permit. Revocation of a development permit is currently permitted through statute, through GS 160D 405. So a lot of the language that we put in this proposed amendment was actually taken from the state statute. And what that says is the development permit may be revoked by the village planner after notifying the permit holder in writing and stating the reason for the revocation. The permit revocation shall follow the same process. That means that with the required for issuance of the development permit, including any required notice or hearing, in the review and approval of any revocation of that approval. Sorry, there's a comma. In the review and approval of any revocation of that approval. Terms under which a development permit may be revoked include A, a substantial departure from the approved application plans or specifications, or B, refusal or failure to comply with requirements of this ordinance or any other applicable local development regulations or any state law delegated to the village for enforcement purposes in lieu of the state. We've been questioned a couple times on that particular provision and asked about what other what other potential ones would be out there. Well, we've been talking as part of the stormwater master plan about potentially developing our own local erosion control program. In that case, what would happen is the state would delegate enforcement of that program to us. So that's an example of that. floodplain management, things like that. C, false statements or misrepresentations made in securing the approval. That means, if you've lied on your application. And then D, any development approval mistakenly issued in violation of an applicable state or local law. We hate having to do that because it means we made a mistake, but it does happen on occasion. Rarely, I might add. Revocation of a development permit by the village planner may be appealed. So anything that we do as part of our duties with administering the PDO, that is all appealable, as you know, to the Board of Adjustment. So that, in short, and this wouldn't apply just to STRs, this would apply to other permits, other permits that we issue under the PDO. And the language itself, I've looked at, this is, when we're looking at developing ordinances, as with the rest of the proposed amendments, we're looking at also what other communities are doing. So this is this is probably pretty common language. I've been actually looking at, there's been a lot of banter on some of our blogs about, what those letters look like. And it's going to be a note where if we find that that we have to revoke a development permit, we have to go through that due process. So we're going to have to notify them. We're going to have to do a lot of the same things that we have to do when they apply for the development permit. So it will require some investigatory work from us.
Darren, can you help me tie this to the discussion of STRs? Maybe I'm the only one who's not getting the full connective tissue on this.
If a property was previously approved as a STR, basically, or if there's tracking or violations of whatever previous approval there had been, then it would also apply to those properties, because it's not, I guess, defined right now, or how it relates to the approval process.
But this section can be implemented regardless of the status of the STRs, whether they're approved or disapproved.
Sure.
And,
But Darren,
there's an and in SR9, we actually have a specific provision
That's right.
That's where you're going?
Yeah, that's where I'm going.
That deals with revocation, that's number 13. So as part of a,
It's independent, is that correct, of?
this is independent.
Right.
Correct.
But the scheme is you get your development permit. If there are 3 verified violations, you get your development permit to have an STR. If there are 3 verified violations within a 365-day period, then the planner can go ahead and notify the permit holder that their permit to have the STR is being revoked for a year,
Correct.
a 365-day period. If that person appeals, they come before the Board of Adjustment. And that's where the Board of Adjustment needs to look at those 3 verified violations and make sure that they were all indeed violations, so we are not hurting this person's due process.
But isn't that a jump to a different section where we're going to?
That is, but it was.
Special requirements?
Yep.
Okay.
It started with Paul was looking where was the connection, so I hope I made the connection for you.
You did, but maybe there are stupid questions, and I'll quit asking them.
No, it's not a
so I
stupid
think
question.
I think that earlier when Jules, mentioned that all this is interconnected, I think that was
It's the enforcement piece.
this is one of those
Okay.
pieces.
Yeah.
Question on the non-underlined highlighted text in the notes. It talks about basically when they could reapply, but it's not, it kind of sounds like it could be immediate as long as they address the issues from the application.
I thought it was revoked for 365 days.
That is for specifically that's under SR9, that is not in the general development permit. So if we revoke a development permit, say they have violations we have some violations related to them building a house, and we continue to violate, and they continue to go through the process, and they have some violations, we can revoke the development permit. Then it should be a disincentive enough for them to have to go back through the process, pay the permit fees again, and all that. But there's not a minimum waiting period for something like that. We specifically built the waiting period into the short-term rental for that to be another disincentive for non-management.
As far as, I'm sorry, someone made a speaking sound over there. Yeah? No? Okay. As far as all other permits are concerned, because as you say, this is a general revocation scheme work, framework. I don't really have any questions about it. My question is, if we're imagining using this to revoke somebody's development permit to have an STR, and they're before the Board of Adjustment looking for a due process. I begin wondering about the evidence that's going to be brought to us to show a verified violation. And I don't know if that's part of this discussion or another discussion. I'm happy to table it. But I wonder about that evidence, how that evidence is collected, who collects that evidence, what is if we're in a quasi-judicial proceeding, the evidence that's before us, we need to have a sense of its authenticity.
Correct.
And then I also wonder whether or not this board, or the Board of Adjustment, would have subpoena power, administrative subpoena power. Because if we're really looking into whether or not someone is conducting a business as a short-term rental, that may be a germane question at some point.
It may, and what I could add, and I don't want to get into that we feel that we can enforce it. We feel that we can enforce this, like, it might be more difficult, there might be more, we might need more sources of information, but it's just like any other use violation. We're gonna follow our normal compliance process. With an STR, a lot of companies have, or a lot of communities, I was talking to Asheville this morning, they outsource some of that. So they outsource the information. So they outsource a company that will search 54 databases for addresses. They then provide that information to Asheville, and then they follow up with their own investigation. So that's something that we do. They look at screenshots, they look at listings, they look at addresses, they look at reviews, things like that. So that's the way as we move forward this process, we'll continue to talk with some of these other communities that are more mature in doing this, because they've been doing this for a number of years. They struggle with it at times, probably because it's not, sometimes if it goes underground, that's a little bit more difficult. But if you're advertising through one of the major sites, I think it can be handled more easily that way. But again, that's part of the enforcement and the permitting process. While it might be a little bit more difficult at times, it's something that I'm sure that we can do, because it's just another compliance investigation.
Hey, Darren, can you answer for me? Who currently is the village planner that would make this revocation, this decision?
That would probably come up to me because this would be a pretty significant.
Yeah, it's a lot to bear, isn't it?
So,
yeah. And today, as this is defined, is it solely the village planner that would make this decision?
Correct.
Okay. So I think one of the things to think about is not necessarily today, as we put a lot of trust in you, but what could happen in 10 years? Where are we going to evolve to in 15 years? And really, the ethical stance of our village planner is going to would be very, very important in this case, as well as our Board of Adjustment. So I think the process that the Board of Adjustment would play in this is also a very important one to consider. I know that we currently have the process, but case number one, that would happen, we would need to probably have that figured out. And I think that, those of us who sit on the Board of Adjustment, I think that we want to make sure that our professionalism, that our approach, that our opportunity to perform correctly, the intent of the ordinances as stated in our directions as Board of Adjustment members are realistic. And I think that's just something for us to make sure that we understand is really what is the role of the Board of Adjustment. Is the village planner a singular person that then is going to have a lot of pressures upon that person, right and left, then and such to make a decision? And I think that's a tough thing. So.
Well, and I appreciate that. But you also, I'm not a rogue. This is not a rogue position.
I know you're not.
This, remember, I also, I do have a supervisor, that's the village manager. So, things like this where this is anything that's moving through the system that's going to potentially be appealed, something that's going to potentially result in court action. These are things that we're having discussions with management on. something, something like this, which potentially is a property right. These are things that we're just not making that decision in a vacuum.
I think we can assume that this process will evolve,
Yes.
over the next 5 to 10 years. I think we can assume that to where a lot of things are defined. But I think that we have to make at least some sort of horizon view past us. Past when my Board of Adjustment term expires, past whenever you decide to retire from this place, because I hope you stay forever, then where are we? And I think that's just something that's just my point, is just to make sure that we've got that horizon view in this thing of the what ifs, the hows, and the whats, and how this thing's going to flow, and really the pressure that we put on you at that point.
And all of the process,
This isn't terribly unique, though, in the sense that sprinkled throughout the Pinehurst Development Ordinance are responsibilities and decisions delegated to the village planner. I mean, and that's extremely common. And one of the responsibilities of the Board of Adjustments, besides land use variances, are to rule on decisions by the staff, whether those are correct or not. In fact, they saw one a few years ago. So I don't find this particularly unusual to say that the decision to revoke will be essentially in the hands of the village planner, as is the decision to actually approve the development permit.
that's correct. Because we would be approving the development permit on the other end, so yes, correct.
Then your decision, one way or the other, could then be brought to the Board of Adjustment. Okay, as the
Decision
process
would-
stands today. Again, as you pointed out, we saw, 2 years ago?
Years ago.
Okay, all right. Any other?
One question I have, and we can table it till we get to the verified violation place, because I think that's where it more properly sits with the whole enforcement mechanism, is I think it's important for us to talk about back of the envelope cost. Because this will be an added cost to taxpayers. If we are hiring an outside organization to go through all of these listings on VRBO and Airbnb, et cetera, there's also the possibility of, in order to verify a violation, having another compliance officer. I don't know if we're planning on outsourcing that to a PI. I have no idea, but that's something that we probably ought to think about, just so everyone's aware that this type of implementation will not come for free. And we can table that till we get into violations, but I think it's a real thing.
Well, and so I think this is great. I think it's needed. My only question, kind of to Jeremy's point, beyond the horizon of us, your definition, my definition of substantial departure from may be quite different. So how do we define that, right? So is somebody's, siding, or, I mean, whatever the case is, color variations, what is the definition of substantial departure from? Do you have like an example you could give us?
No, not right now. And really, it's going to be us looking at what, we have to actually be looking at what we're interpreting as a substantial departure. So we're going to make an interpretation at some point. That interpretation, again, is always appealable to the Board of Adjustment. So that's the best I can do, because I can't speculate. I would have to be looking at what that actual violation is. If they said that they were going to put up a house and it was, the house looked nowhere near what was approved on the plans, it's probably a substantial departure.
Correct. My point being, it's a little subjective. We know you, we trust you, Darren, we get it. But again, beyond our horizon, somebody else's definition of substantial may be different. So if there's any way to tighten that up, I'd welcome that discussion and opportunity.
I just want to ask one question of clarification. This section 4.2.12, development means what? Does it mean the short-term rentals, the homestays, and the bed and breakfasts? Because they all can be considered businesses. The short-term rental is no different than staying in a bed and breakfast. So I just want to know if this whole section applies to all three categories.
Apply to any development permit.
It would.
Any development permit, correct.
And how do you guys handle this now? Because there's not anything, if you have a significant variance or substantial difference in it, I mean, just internally go to the applicant and say, you need to fix this, and they're not necessarily required? And I agree this is needed, I'm just asking how it's handled.
Well, there's other things, like if we see that they're departing, we'll use another, and Alex, I can't think of what that provision is, but we would send out a NOV based on the permit issued and looking at the plans approved. We just don't have this process set up that is another additional hammer to potentially use for those who don't want to comply with some of the things we do. Because a lot of times when we issue a notice of violations, sometimes it gets a little tricky, and sometimes it's a longer process to bring some people into compliance. So having that development permit revocation is just another tool that we don't currently have. Alex, what were you thinking specifically on Matt's question? I knew I'd get you involved here.
Thank you.
Welcome, Alex.
So just a couple of points about what I've heard relative to this section, and then maybe we can move on to the next one. Maybe there's some more important questions you guys have, but one, thank you for your trust in Darren and the rest of our staff, because we do a pretty good job of making sure we're doing the right thing. Raise your hand I'm sure you can put on one hand how many appeals in the past 10 years have probably come to the Board of Adjustment. So we do take this very, very, very careful consideration. Also, process for that, I can't think of maybe a handful of times that we've kind of quote unquote revoked a permit, and that's really basically because it's expired, it's ran out of time. An application and approval is issued, work hasn't begun, regulations have changed, it's been 2 years since they've begun, and we just notify them, hey, we're going to revoke, and obviously by then someone has moved on to something else, property may have sold, so that would be another reason. And we always had the statute to fall back on if we needed. But there are obvious other enforcement mechanisms. If we notice someone has substantially departed for whatever reason that may be, they're in violation. So there's that process that begins, and we also have the hammer of a stop work order if work is under construction and we notice something is completely out of compliance. So we give them that opportunity to come into compliance, and luckily that is usually what happens.
This kind of completes that toolbox, or we're hoping it completes our toolbox and just gives us another option to deal with some of the more tricky cases that we run into, which again are infrequent, but we like that, this is a tool that we would like to have in our toolbox at this point.
So I think today, of course, our narrowed vision is on STRs, but in this case, in conversation of this, we need to take the wider vision of overall development permitting in our discussion. Is there any other questions or points on this, or anything that anybody would like to?
I think the text is clear.
On the text portion of this?
Yeah, I think the text is clear. We've
Okay.
all had 2 weeks to read it. If we had anything to amend, we should have come here today with those suggestions.
Before we move on.
I think I only had one comment or suggestion, if you will, Darren, relative to the wording, which it seems to me that some statement relative to how we're going to, in other words, there should be not only just the fact that we're going to revoke a development permit, but that implies a cease and desist, if you will, either in the activity related to the development permit or the use, depending upon which type of development permit you're talking about. I would just, if it's possible and it makes sense and it's common in other jurisdictions, some type of statement as to what that means to revoke a development permit, that the intention is that it'll be immediately a cease and desist order, if you will. I don't know whether that's appropriate or not, but that would be my only suggestion.
That's something I'll certainly do some research on before it gets to the council.
Overall, I think it's well constructed as a nice umbrella for revocation of any development permit.
As we move forward towards this, if anything like that comes to the front that we want to make a part of our recommendation to council, please bring it back up.
And there's instances where I can think of where a building permit might be sitting, there's a structure sitting on, there's a foundation sitting on the site, or there's a building, it could be half completed or something like that, that would be something I think we have some additional provisions at the site. I'm not sure if we even have site restoration, so we'll have to do some research, but I could see things like that where something's half completed and we want it to be removed.
I don't have precise wording, so I wouldn't
Yeah.
include that in any type of motion. It's just a suggestion.
No, I got it.
All right, we ready to move on? Everybody? Okay, Aaron?
All right, we're flying now. All right. You want to go into definitions quick before we get into the meat of the discussion, which will be SR 9 and then the table? All right, so the definition that we came up with, or we didn't come up with it, we're not groundbreaking in this particular field. There's a lot of communities, and I don't know who we emulated this from, which means we stole it from somebody. I don't know who that is, but but short-term rental is defined as a whole house lodging occupancy where a dwelling unit is offered or made available by short-term lease or other financial consideration for a time period or lease term of less than 30 consecutive days for a cumulative total of more than 14 days in any calendar year. Short-term rentals do not include other lodging uses identified in Table 8.51A of the Table of Permitted and Special Uses and Special Requirements. There's two things, what we're seeing out there is we're seeing that this is relatively common language. Some have the 14 days in them, some don't. But this is generally a pretty common definition that we're seeing, at least within some of the research in this state and with some of the other ones that we've researched.
I think it's clearly understood
Already-
what a short-term rental is.
You guys took into consideration February being 28 days, and would we force someone to be an occupant of February plus 2 days into March? For 30 days?
Okay.
less?
Oh,
Sure you guys considered that?
the whole February thing?
Well, you
Repeat that
know,
one more time.
Well, February being 28 days.
Yeah.
It's just
And
30
so-
consecutive.
There's just
So
30
just 30
consecutive.
consecutive
Yeah,
days
there's not,
and leave it.
there's not a calendar. You had,
Okay,
it's not-
all right.
it's just 30 consecutive, less than 30 consecutive days.
In theory, it makes perfect sense to me. What troubles me about the 14-day carve-out is I cannot imagine how you determine and enforce that. Where does that clock start running? At the point that somebody entered the non-rental rental? How do you know? And so the neighbor complains across the street and says they had somebody in there for the US Open, and they were in there for 10 days, and now they've got somebody in there for kids golf, and they've been in there for 6 days, and I want you to get them out. You have no way of knowing what happened 6 months ago. So to me, that 14 days, while I understand the emotional desire to have it in there, because we are a golf community and we want people to be able to open their homes for things like the US Open, that 14 days creates an absolutely unenforceable nightmare.
I would
Well,
say.
at the same time, the 14 days is critical in a lot of ways relative to your income tax situation. I mean, you can rent a unit for 14 days or less and not declare the income as rental income for that year.
Well, that's the
Whereas-
IRS. This is
well-
Pinehurst.
Well, it's just, are you being honest with the village, or are you being honest with the IRS? I
Not
mean,
my
it's just,
problem.
it's very common to see the 14 days in the description of the short-term rental. So I don't find that it's, even though it's very difficult to count in some cases, I don't believe it adds, I believe it adds some substance to the definition.
Can I just add one thing? It's going to require some documentation. There's no doubt that the 14 days is going to require us to do some documentation. We know that we have a good reporting apparatus in the community. That's all of us. So we will get some notification at some point, and we're going to have to start tracking. There's been this discussion, this concern that we haven't been tracking the short-term rentals. Well, part of we haven't had a violation to track at that point, so now we're going to start tracking them. So there's going to be two things. If somebody's doing it infrequently, that might make it more difficult. But if you're listing this on some site all the time and we're taking screenshots and we're looking at it, it's going to be a little bit more easy to at least somewhat verify that. And if we do decide to engage with an outside service that will comb the listings, that should make it a little bit easier to determine these things, because I think they can also track history.
Are we going to subpoena VRBO,
That
Airbnb?
I do not know.
I mean, that's the question. We don't know, do we? I mean, it all comes down to enforceability.
It's enforceable. It's
Julia.
difficult, but it's enforceable.
Julia, I have to intercede here because this is going nowhere. We are only an advisory board and not a legal board, so we can make suggestions, but we cannot get so involved in this. We are just reading theirs and trying to add or delete. We have a village legal counsel who has gone through this. If we don't trust him, then maybe we need to get another legal counsel. I mean, I'm feeling like this is going nowhere fast. I mean, look what time it is, and we haven't gotten anywhere. So I appreciate your comments. I appreciate everybody's comments, but I think we need to remember, we're only advisory. We're not making these decisions. We're advisories. We have no legal rights to make these laws. That's the village council's job.
I'm not making laws. I'm pointing out I am doing my job, which is advising council on what's before us. And my advice, by pointing out in this conversation, is that this 14 days is practically unenforceable and is only going to be enforceable through a serious amount of expense by this village in subpoenaing records from Airbnb and VRBO. And if that hasn't occurred to our council yet, I'm informing them of that fact.
Okay.
Darren, let me ask this question just on that subject.
And what about when you get a lawsuit because you don't have anything in place and somebody's gotten hurt or killed and they're coming after the village because you have nothing?
I'm not talking about that yet. We're not there
But you're talking
yet.
about how much it's going to cost us to enforce, to have something in place.
Julia raises a valid point. It's going to be difficult, but it's not going to be impossible. You raise some good points. How much resources are we going to put in? Policy decision of the council to decide, do we want to engage with these outside services? But is it enforceable? Yes, it's enforceable. It's just like any other occupancy violation. They are not the easiest to enforce. I used to have to enforce family regulations with unrelateds. It's a difficult regulation to enforce, but it is enforceable.
Pinehurst used to have similar regulations, as you know, about unrelated family. And we'd have to stake out homes and get a warrant and go into people's homes. I'm just pointing out that's potentially the direction we're moving.
You're correct. I don't disagree, Julie. I don't.
Darren, let me ask this question. So once the STR is reported in whatever fashion or identified, then the possible worst-case scenario at that point in time is the clock starts on the 14 days for the whole calendar year.
Correct.
Correct. Okay. All right. So in that aspect, it is at least identifiable beyond anything consistent with Airbnb or VRBO. I mean, we identify it in the
Correct.
community, and it starts on
Correct.
that day.
We'll start gathering the evidence that we can find, and we'll start making note of it. We do this for other types of violations out there. There's other PDO provisions, I believe, that have some timeframes in them that we are actually checking for timeframes on. I can't even think of what it is. I just can't. But it's doable. It's another potentially an administrative burden.
Well, one of the benefits of the 14-day parameter specified here is that depending upon how the short-term rental restriction comes out in the single-family neighborhoods, it gives the ability of someone having a house in an area that may not permit short-term rentals, the ability to rent during the open or some other event during the year without running afoul of any village ordinances or issues.
Correct? So other than Julia's comments, which are taken, are there any other discussions on this actual definition? Any other concerns? I know there's the 14 days. Anything else concerning?
Anyone?
Well, Jules, would you propose to not have the 14-day in there, or would?
I mean, personally, from the standpoint of allowing our community to do what our community does, which is, host big golf tournaments, I like the 14 days. I just want to point out that it is an enforcement nightmare, and it will be very expensive.
I mean, people break the laws all day. I mean, some of them get caught, some of them don't, but you have to have a standard, right? And I think that's all this is just a standard saying. I mean,
Why isn't the 14 days in the homestay
We're not talking about
definition? I know, but it's all the same. Just for clarification.
Oh, because a homestay is going to because it is a different definition. Homestay, you can have a homestay and you can have it, there's no exemption, there's no carve out or exemption needed to allow you to rent out a room. I can't think of a good reason to have it in there at this point.
Yeah, I don't see it either. I just think that in a lot of these issues, the short-term rental, the homestay, and the bed and breakfast have to be treated equally.
Agreed. Especially if one's permitted in a resident or single-family
Right.
residential neighborhood and others are not.
Right, and although not all homestays are bed and breakfasts don't necessarily have the homeowner there.
Bed and breakfasts have an operator or somebody who lives on premises
Yeah.
there. There's a different statutory standard for what a bed and breakfast is. There's bed and breakfast inns, bed and breakfast homes, and there are health and sanitation requirements and inspections that they have to undergo. I actually stayed at a bed and breakfast this weekend, and I talked to them about that. So it's just it is a different standard than what a homestay is. A homestay is not the same thing. And within our PDO, we have a special requirement, an actual special requirement set up for bed and breakfast. We will potentially talk about that for homestay, but we do have a separate requirement for bed and breakfast. And it involves the meal. We talk about the meal in there. So anything else with the short-term rental definition, so we can move on to the next?
Else? Hearing none, let's move forward.
All right, now we'll move on to the special requirement. So, why don't we just start with a discussion of that, because I did go over this, there's a lot in here, so if you want to just start going around and talking about some of the individual requirements that we're proposing, that would probably be more productive use of our time.
I agree, but we definitely have to assume that we've all read through all of these requirements. Is that a good assumption for us all? Yeah, it's a reasonable assumption. Okay, so then I say that let's move on to, we've had plenty of opportunity to do so. I'll give Paul a break on this one unless he wants it, and we'll go ahead and, Luis, do you have any sort of statements on SR 9, any of these, numbered 1 through 10, or in whole? I'm willing to come back to you if needed.
I have no questions.
The one thing that you'll see with these is we've tried to pick up just some basic standards, parking, occupancy, things that, if you're looking at establishing a short-term rental within the community, and it's in an area that's allowed by right, that these, you're gonna come in, we're gonna have a permit that's gonna relate to the vast majority of these standards. So that's gonna be on the permit application form. So that's a lot of what's in here, and a lot of it is actually mirroring what's in our minimum housing standards.
Give Luis a minute, and Matt, are you prepared?
Yeah, the only thing I wanted to verify, and I actually didn't check it beforehand, but the the maximum occupancy per unit is based on 2 adult guests per bedroom. I'm assuming that we define bedroom in the PDO, and obviously some of the comments we've gotten are from people related to, you know.
I think it's in the NC building standards, isn't it?
You have to have a closet, et cetera, et cetera.
Right, so, well, that's, I guess my question is, it pertains to, it doesn't have to have a restroom, but it has to have a closet.
No, it doesn't have to have a closet. It just has to have, it has to have a certain amount of area. It has to have light and ventilation requirements. It used to have closets. But it has to have a certain height. I think it's 7.5 feet, so we picked up on that. So everything that we've put in here is mirroring what's in our minimum housing regulations right now.
I don't have any other comments on these.
Are we on me? Please. Under 1, don't development permits typically run with the land?
They typically do, correct?
So you're saying that this development permit will not run with the land?
That's correct. When the property changes hands, there's going to be a different contact requirement. There are going to be different contacts that we're going to need to have for the management purposes or for handling complaints and things like that. So yeah, we did specifically put that in there, that this would be a difference than some of the other development permits.
Which I totally get. It makes sense for what you're trying to do. Do you run the risk that someone will say this is not truly then a development permit and it's a different type of permit and you're just calling it a development permit?
Or registration or something?
Yeah, like a registration?
Well, registration would be akin to the communities that actually expire yearly. So you see a lot of
Okay.
communities out there that will expire these development permits
Right.
annually, like Chapel Hill does it. I talked to Asheville this morning, they are no longer expiring them yearly because of the whole registration requirements.
Right.
But, if you look at it akin to when some other businesses change hands and we get a new user within the commercial occupancy space, I think a lot of times we're checking on a development permit for them, so we have updated contact or updated information of what's in that.
So they have to file for a new development permit or do they update the
It
existing?
might be a use permit. I just can't think. I think it might be Alex, can you just comment quickly on that for me?
So typically, that's if someone is, a business area is vacated and a new business is going to come into that same space, one restaurant to another restaurant, then we do a zoning use development permit. And that triggers other, requirements, I guess, to fire marshal and the building inspector to go out and especially if there is a true change in use, like a retail to maybe a restaurant. You had just you're selling clothing to go into a restaurant per se. But I think that Darren can speak more to the intent of this language under item 1, but I do think the intent for that was to, when you obtain a development permit, then yes, you have to be as the applicant or you have to be the owner or a contract purchaser or other agent for acting on behalf of that owner. So if that ownership changes, then, you would like to have that ability to have an updated contact.
We were trying to get that information and maybe I'll have to do a little bit more research on that because your discussion of being a license or registered, does that make it more akin to a license or registration? That's something I'm going to have to look into a little bit more again once before it goes to council, because you may make a valid point. So I will have to, I've made a note to talk about that one.
And when we do issue a development permit, does that trigger an inspection? Are we going to need an inspection in order to make sure that these?
I'm not intending on, the goal, I'm not intending on having any type of inspection at this point. I would handle it something to an affirmation, so you come in and so we would review a development permit, and there'd be we'd be looking at a floor plan, we'd be looking at a parking plan, and then there would be boxes on there for do you meet all the requirements in the code? And then if we got a complaint, that's when we'd follow up.
Could we require, in order to get that complaint, if a complaint is indeed warranted, can we require to have the permit in the unit such that if I'm the renter, I know that I should have a smoke detector in every bedroom or a carbon monoxide on every floor. So there's, because the only person who's going to know whether or not they're in violation is the person in the unit. So you want to give that renter a tool so they know what they're entitled to, so they can complain or report a violation if things aren't the way they're supposed to be in that unit.
I agree. Were you posting the rules, you're posting the various rules that you're required to adhere to within the unit prominently posted? I think, Jack, had you noted something, when you're looking at the SR, was that a proposal that you had been making or not? I can't recall. I don't disagree with the requirement that we could add that as another
And I don't know whether
addition.
we post it in the unit or we have a searchable database where if I'm a renter, I know I can go to this database and see what I'm supposed to have in this unit. But somehow we have to get the information to the party that's supposed to be being protected.
Not an uncommon requirement. I've seen it, I have seen it in other codes. I think it's been in other state codes, but it's something that I have seen, that the rules are required to be placarded somewhere within the
Right.
unit.
I have seen that, that prominently displayed is the rules and regulations and contact information and so forth, yeah.
Right, that just seems important. Under 10, we go to a lot of trouble at the end of that paragraph to describe what sounds like a studio. Do we just want to call it a studio? I mean, I don't know, I don't care, but it just seems reasonable. Under 12, we've got special events, which I assume are special events as defined in the PDO.
It's not currently defined in the PDO. That would require some interpretation, but the way we interpret it at this
Well,
point.
special event is described in the PDO, capital S, capital E, but large gatherings are not.
Okay.
And so I'm thinking, if we mean a special event as defined in the PDO, we ought to say that's what we mean. Because my 80th birthday party for my mom may feel like a special event to me, but it's not a special event in the PDO. And then a large gathering, we probably ought to define what that is if we're using that language.
And the intent of that, and again, it was the intent in looking at that was for the commercial use of a residential property for some type of ticketed event like we saw down in the Village Center.
Right, which is what a special event is.
Yeah.
In the PDO. A special event is something done for like a consumer, I forget the language, but it's an economic event.
Yeah, it's any activity or circumstance of a business or organization which is not part of its daily activities.
Right, but it says or large gathering, and that large gathering is not defined. So example, I had a bar mitzvah with 100 people at it. That's a large gathering, but it's not a special event.
No, if you're running that as the business, it's a venue center. We're advertising it as a venue, some type of venue.
Sure.
My house. That would be the intent.
I get you. I'm just saying if we're using that language, we need to be clear about what we mean. When you get down to 13A, you're referencing Chapter 152 of the Pinehurst Municipal Code. That's, of course, relating, just throwing it back to the PDO. So some of those violations may not be at all related to the use of the property as a short-term rental. For example, the door is the wrong color if we're in the historic district. And I don't think that's what we mean. So I think if you're going to be looking for 3 verified violations and then just referencing the entire PDO, I think you might be casting a larger net than you intend to cast. So I don't know whether you want to reference, Section 92.01 of the municipal code, or whether you want to go to sections of the PDO that speak to overgrown weeds or garbage cans. But I think a certain amount of specificity is required here. Otherwise, you're going to be closing down people's rentals because someone doesn't like the color of their door.
Not necessarily. I mean,
Only where permitted already,
Right, only where permitted.
which is problematic.
So that to me is just something where maybe that's what they meant to do, but I don't know if it's what they meant to do. Chapter 153, Section D, Chapter 153 talks about the municipal code establishing minimum housing standards. Again, if we're not having an inspection, you need to get that information in the renter's hands, so we have some way of catching that kind of violation. And then E, I think your sentences don't say what you mean to say there.
Okay?
I would suggest a verified violation is a determination by a code enforcement official, law enforcement officer, or judge, period. Following such determination, comma, notice of a violation shall be issued by the village, period. So forth and so on. Because otherwise, you're in a loop between verifying the violation and noticing it. Does that make sense?
It does make sense.
Okay.
Make sure I get that wording, please.
Yeah. And that's all I have.
Thank you, Jules. Yep. Jack?
Those are good suggestions. I have, for the most part, I thought the table of special requirements was fine, except for a few exceptions. And one just came up, which I think is a good idea, which is the requirement of a prominently displayed notification of the contact names and/or, most importantly, village rules, garbage disposal, et cetera, those kinds of things. But for the most part, I liked it. I had a couple suggestions on number 5 about where it talked about fire extinguishers and smoke detectors. I'd like to see a more robust description, and I'll give you an example. I'm not a genius enough to have made this up. I copied this out of another
A lot of this is,
regulation. For example, number A, shall maintain fully operational building and fire code compliant smoke and carbon dioxide detectors in the short-term rental property as required by law. And B, shall maintain at least one or such other number as required by any applicable building, fire, or other applicable code, fully operational and charged fire extinguisher. And C, shall maintain unobstructed escape routes from the short-term rental property in the event of fire. And again, I copied this directly
Sure,
out
I've
of
seen that
another
language,
regulation
yeah.
from another district. I think they provide some robustness rather than say, have fire extinguishers or have smoke detectors, a little more robust. They actually have to work, that kind of thing. And in the end, I recommend a new statement relative to the owner or agent responsibility, informing renters of the contact information. And again, I will read what I copied from another district. That is, during any lease of any short-term rental property, the owner or the short-term rental agent, 1, shall be available during any short-term rental period to respond to a complaint or other matter related to the operation or behavior of any short-term leasee of the short-term rental property. And 2, shall be available by telephone at all times during the short-term rental period and capable of being physically present at the short-term rental property or taking other responsive action within 1 hour of notification of a complaint or other matter related to the short-term rental property. And 3, shall prominently display in the short-term rental unit contact information for the owner or short-term rental agent responsible for responding to complaints. Once again, I copied these from another municipalities' regulations relative to short-term rental. They're pretty aggressive, but I think that's the kind of thing that maybe we should think about including.
first of all, we emulate what other communities are doing in that regard, so that's what you're looking at. I think I don't disagree with the smoke detector discussion. I'd have to think a little bit more about that last discussion about having somebody within a certain amount of, a certain period, a certain radius. We don't do that for any other type of use. So, and I know this is unusual as well, but I think I have some concern with that. I'll have to think through that and the whole licensing registration implication on that.
I don't understand that, but it just sort of,
I
as I
understand.
recall, I'd have to read it again, But the smoke detector thing essentially said there should be smoke detectors. It doesn't say whether they're operational or whether you have to
Yeah, no.
maintain them. God forbid, and you've been in units where you go into the smoke detector, the battery's been taken out long ago, you know.
No, I don't disagree, Jack.
So I don't think it hurts to say something about at least operational.
I'm not disagreeing with those. We can put that in there. That's fine. I'm more worried about that last bit about the.
It's pretty aggressive, but it's food for thought.
No,
Can you
and
possibly scan that and email it to us?
It should be in-
my brain's not going to remember. Do you have it? Oh,
You
I
should,
have it.
you should have that. Jack provided those comments to us.
Thanks, Jack.
Can I get that? I don't have that right here.
Anyway, like I said, I copied those. I thought they
No.
were fairly aggressive, but interesting and useful. So those are my comments relative to the SR9.
This is serious form of flattery, right? So you've put that out, so, I mean, general discussion by the board on Jack. More discussion on it, well, Jack's put some comments on the table on that. So how does the board feel about what Jack put out there? Is suggesting, I should say.
You're asking a question, how does the board feel?
Jack, on the smoke detector issue, let's all find it.
It sounds like we're establishing standards for a commercial piece of property. Now, why would you have a commercial piece of property in a residential neighborhood?
Because it's currently permitted by right, and you're
Thank you, David.
taking it away.
Jack, can you maybe shorten your couple points there real quick again and maybe paraphrase?
I just wanted some more robust description, rather than just having smoke detectors, the operational status and whether or not we should require fire extinguishers. That would be the only question.
That's in there?
I'm open, I just thought it was a good idea. The second being the notification and without registration, but within the unit itself, that the tenant can in fact have the
got it.
information as to who is the responsible party for them to contact.
I got it.
Those are, I mean, I think those are good, safe comments. They're logical. But, you know, to the best of my knowledge, the fire marshal only comes and inspects commercial buildings, required to have the proper exit sign. So I go back, you know, if we went so far that now we've got commercial used buildings, you know, and I think that's the discussion here, I mean, that we've had and we've talked around it. So I think that's good. It makes sense. You know, there's a lot of building codes that are here in red. That makes sense. You don't do that for long-term rentals, you know, but there are standards that need to be done. Your insurance company is going to ensure you do it because you're liable. You know, so there's a lot of things. But again, we're starting to put standards on short-term rentals that are in residential areas that are only current standards for commercial built properties.
Paul, those are, the smoke detector requirement, the smoke detector requirement is a requirement.
For residential, correct,
Correct.
building code. I'm talking the fire extinguishers,
Oh.
the exit plan, the exit marking, all those other things. That's not for residential.
Well, I think the idea for the egress plan would be to make sure if we are, you're going to have, for where they are permitted, it's going to be a transient use. You're going to have people who are less used to being in that facility.
I'm not saying it's not safe. It makes sense. If you're there only for a couple of days of weekends and 52 weekends, you've got a bunch of different people in a residential area, it would make sense to have smoke alarms. It would make sense to have egress routes and all the other things that you would see in a commercial building.
And that goes back to Julia's wanting to have, these are the rules. I mean, if you've clearly got an exit blocked off in your short-term rental, and and somebody makes a complaint, we should be able to go in there, and then under the rules that we're proposing here, and I think it's probably already in the building code, to be able to make sure that can be brought into compliance for safety purposes.
Paul, do you have any input on Jack's proposal to include the contact information of the short-term rental owner and ensuring that they're able to respond within 1 hour, or anybody else?
makes sense, but do we want to establish that as a standard? You know, I would want someone to have my contact information if they were residing in a property that I'm liable for.
Well, it's a contact information for issues and problems. It's not meant to be identifying the owner per se. If it happens to be the owner, it's the owner. If it's an agent, or someone else designated by the person who rented the unit. I found it rather interesting. I found it appropriate possibly. I'm not hung up on it. We can go ahead without it. I'm not going to filibuster for that particular unit, for that particular item.
Well, it seems like, too, if that same information was in some kind of searchable database, if I'm living next door to that short-term rental and they're carrying on at 2 in the morning and I'm uncomfortable about calling the police, I sure as heck can check the database and call that agent.
Well,
You know, that's useful.
Yeah, I didn't contemplate that step. I didn't contemplate anything other than the actual tenant having the information in front of them.
I think Julia hits on the point that we were trying to achieve some of that. That's the whole intent of having that development permit. The development permit establishes, that contact list. That is certain, that then does become searchable.
Well, we can't go down that route, we know that, so, the registration route.
Not a registration, but there's a development permit. Once we get a development permit on file, the development permit is then on file.
But you don't ask in the development permit for the information, you just say that information should be made available to the tenant.
Yeah, I'm not disputing that. I'm saying that it's going to become searchable once we create the record. So if somebody needs to find out who is in the neighborhood, who is running that unit, searching for that development permit, we'll pick up that information.
I didn't make that leap, but I believe you.
Anybody else? It's still Jack's comment. Anybody else want to make a comment relative to his points there? Okay, if not, Jack will still continue with you unless you're complete. No, I'm done. Okay.
Jeremy, I'll comment.
Yeah.
And, on the distance or the time, I mean, that, it seems like maybe there's some play there. I mean, I'm open to what staff thinks is reasonable for that. I looked at a few other areas as well and didn't, thought about that, but didn't see anything that stood out in my memory.
Some of the question could also be if the person doesn't make it within the relative preset time, is that in itself a violation?
Right.
Is it, and then would it be a race to the short-term rental? So,
I like the contact information. I'm not a big fan of the 1 hour radius. I understand the intent, but as long as they have somebody there that can respond, and they should be
Reasonable period of time.
reasonable is
Just an hour.
important. What's reasonable? I think that's the debate, right?
and that then plays into the enforcement as well.
My other comment is on what Paul was hinting at, which is certainly an interesting point about uses and requirements not typical to residential. So I drew myself back to the special requirement section to just refresh. And, it's interesting. It says, in any case where a use listed in the table has a number in this column, must comply. Special requirements may affect the development of use in all zoning districts in which the use is allowed or only in certain districts. So it does seem like in some of these special requirements, the nature is maybe to allow some overlap. The question is how much, and that's obviously subjective and discretionary and a part of our charge, but it does play with my mind a little bit about this for the same reason that it seems reasonable to have those requirements. Obviously, they're typically commercial, but if we're saying that this use is going to be in the table, then it probably fits to try to grab some things from other areas that are appropriate and as part of our recommendation.
Yeah, and if the short-term rental is rented by a licensed realtor who's following their requirements, which is statute, all of that's there, you know what I mean? So it would be the folks who, hey, it's got laid off from my job, need to make my mortgage payment, I'm going to rent my place, and really don't do the due diligence for a variety of reasons. I'm not pointing fingers at them, who may not understand, all the safety thing that goes on there and the lease and all the other stuff that's governed already governed by NC statute, so.
And that is part of the reason why we put some of the more, what we felt were some of the more important aspects to pick up on.
Stating the obvious.
Yeah, correct. Because we know it's already required by law over here, but a lot of people don't even understand what the minimum housing regulations are. So we felt if we did this as part of a permitting process, we would pick up on, some of those concerns. So I really don't have much of a heartburn with the fully operational building and fire code compliant smoke and carbon monoxide detectors. I don't have an issue with that. I did question the fire extinguisher part. It should be there. I have one in my own house. That's not a hard code requirement. So I see a benefit in having that. And the unobstructed escape routes, I can see that being in there as well. Any other comments on this portion of?
Yeah, I did have a couple comments here. I think we left off with Jack. Dave, did you have anything?
Let's go ahead and continue.
Yeah.
Dave.
I don't have an issue with regulating short-term rentals through permitting and zoning requirements. In order to do so, you have to define them. You have to create some parameters. What I have the issue with, and what we still haven't seen, is currently, if we were to look at this table, short-term rentals are permitted by right in every single-family residential neighborhood, because they're not defined.
Fine, correct.
So therefore, they're permitted by right. So making this change takes away a fundamental property right from everyone who is operating a short-term rental right now. There hasn't been anything to show where do you draw the line between residential use between a short-term rental and somebody who owns that property? Where it can be kind of blurry depending on the kind of owner that is there. Say they travel 6 days out of the week, they're there, whenever it may be for a short period of time. There's nothing showing that type of ownership is either as harmful or less harmful than a short-term rental being there. Short-term rentals versus long-term rentals, where does that line shift? Where does that impact change where it's harmful to have a short-term rental as your neighbor versus a long-term rental? We haven't seen that. When we talk about costs for not having regulations in place, we don't know what those are. Some people may have been sued. We know what the costs are for over-regulating at this point. And that's what I can't get behind with what's presented right now. I'm fine with these special requirements. Permit this use in single-family residential areas and include permitting requirements, include safety functions that make owners responsible, that give them some ownership of their property and protect neighbors, protect tenants. It's an enforcement mechanism at that point. By stripping that right that's currently permitted, it's a risk that until you know what cards you're holding, it's not prudent in that regard to take that step. There's other guinea pigs. You look at Highlands, if you review what Highlands has in front of them, or what was approved by their council without being even opened up for public comment, it's similar in the restrictions to what's being presented here. Let someone else be the guinea pig is all I'm saying. What's here right now, I like the comments we've had. I agree adding those and adding to them more permitting requirements that are going to support building codes and safety, including owner information, so that, again, tenants or whoever needs to contact some responsible party, require that to be placed in a conspicuous place in the rental unit. But utilizing those enforcement mechanisms are a little more defensible than totally, destroying a property right that somebody has right now. So as written, again, can't do it because the table of permitted uses creates a risk that, is too large at this point. If we can somehow, again, permit it subject to the special requirements in those single-family residential areas, I think there's less of an issue. But at this point, by taking that away, you're regulating users or owners versus actual use, and that ends up being problematic.
My question to you,
That's the conversation, the next conversation though, isn't it, about the table
Well,
of uses?
well, somewhat, but I want
An
to make,
overriding conversation.
yeah,
Is the overriding conversation.
I was going to make the point a minute ago, and I'll use it now, that I want to make sure that we as a board review that the table of use. I know we kind of jumped past it into the definitions. But just for some clarity, you agree with a lot of the ordinance, the way it's written, you would just prefer the table of use to include residential areas, is that right? I mean,
Because it's permitted right now. Because it's undefined, it's permitted by use in every single residential zone. The only way that it's removed from those residential zones is by assigning a definition to short-term rentals so that it can be regulated. So therefore, if we just assign the definition without changing anything else, it would be allowed in those single-family zones.
If it appears on the row side as a row in the definition, it must have an indication within each one of the zoning districts whether it's permitted or not. If it's blank, it is not permitted.
I think that,
But currently, because there's no definition, if you were to create that table, assigning the definition that short-term rental has right now, they are currently permitted in all of those zones by right, with no regulation, no special requirements.
we're currently not regulating them.
I think
And are
that's why we're
therefore-
here
and
having
are
this
therefore
discussion.
allowed.
That is correct.
okay, I just feel like you need a little bit of clarification there, thanks. Anything else on that point, or anything? Okay, all right, Philip?
Keeping in mind, we're still in SR9.
Yes.
We haven't moved the table yet.
I don't know that I could say anything and follow up David to be as eloquent as him, so I agree with David. I'd also agree with Jack about the fire extinguishers. Not to be funny, I do. I think that should be added. I think it's important, but question in general about duplicating efforts here. When we're writing PDO, some of this stuff like occupancy for 2 adult guests per bedroom, is there not other state law we can reference that way, like object-oriented, right? So you reference the state statute for these, so we don't have to go back and rewrite that in a year if that changes. Same thing with fire code or something else. I mean, could we reference those versus writing them out and have to come back for another amendment? Just thinking efficiency, it's not something to talk out. I'm just making a suggestion for future.
Yeah, we try to do that where it makes sense. I just have to think through that. Philip, I don't have an answer.
Anything else? All right, Paul?
Again, table of use, I mean, that's where the discussion's going to be. So all these standards in the red text, very common. I mean, safety is paramount, especially people who don't know the building. At night, power goes out, there's a fire, how do you exit? So, assuming that STRs, continue here, yeah, I would, I don't know how far I'd go to regulate it, but I would make sure that any homeowner who is, whether he goes through a licensed brokerage or on his own, understand what the standard is to make sure we don't have a situation we all regret. David pointed out that, we do have a right now to do STRs. I think the standard has changed. We've seen the numbers of the number of increased STRs out there, and as you do that, you start regulating. If we had 0 STRs, we would probably not have a conversation, and if they weren't permitted, I know we would have probably saved 8 hours of our life already. So, as we go, I wouldn't go overboard, but I would certainly look at err on the side of safety. I wouldn't worry about where trash cans are. That's irrelevant. That's an eyesore. It never killed anyone because there was a trash can on the side of the road. However, as we go to the table of use, all these regulations and the permitting is fine as long as they're in areas that are accommodating. And I just don't think folks want it in their single-family residence. I think an exception, it may fit here or it may fit in the table of use, but I think the exception should be, and I think Jules had mentioned it earlier, when lodging capacity within the Pinehurst, Aberdeen, Southern Pines area is at capacity for some of the large events that happen annually or every 4 years, 3 years, whatever it is, then exceptions should be made. I don't think we need to put a whole lot in that. People are going to cheat. They're not going to follow that, but it does open up to meet needs that could be needed in the area. And we'll talk table of the use, I guess, next, but no issues there. Go as far as you want with permitting and, commercializing essentially inspections if needed. Thanks.
Thank you. I want to go ahead and go back to Luis. Did you have any comments? That would give you a little bit of time. None? Okay. All right, so no further comments on that section there.
Before we move away, just Aaron, please make sure that section 13, we've got that figured out, because that's the revocation of the permit.
13A you're talking about? especially?
Yeah, well, 13 in general.
Yeah.
But A especially, because that's where it's going to come back to us as the Board of Adjustment. So we need to make sure that we know exactly why folks are losing their permits and that we've got the tools to suss that out and, do our job. Thanks.
Jeremy, and per Jules' earlier comment, I will want to come back to 14 after we talk about the table of uses.
Okay, understood. He wants to address 14 after we talk about the table of uses.
Okay. Are we ready to move on to the table of uses?
Sir?
Okay. What's everybody's thought?
Oh,
6:30?
Let me,
Hard stop at 6:30?
well,
I mean, when we entered the meeting tonight, I didn't know we had a hard stop.
Let's get
Oh,
this
no,
done.
there was no hard stop. It was just it was a recommended time.
Can I take a restroom stop?
Yes, I think.
I delayed you with Matt. I apologize for that.
No, it's okay. I do think it's appropriate at this point in time. Let's go ahead and call a break, and let's be back here at 22. Thank you. Seats, we're going to go ahead and continue our board meeting. We're going to go ahead and turn it back over to Darren for the next step. And we still have a couple board members still on break, and they're invited to come back and take a seat. Darren?
Well, I guess this is the part of the proposed amendment process where we'd start filling in on the table of uses, X's, where potential STRs could be located. So the intent is to go through this table, talk about, what the current proposal is, and then make a recommendation with respect to whether you support the current or there should be additional districts added with a recommendation with more X's. So that's really where it starts. And let's start with where the X's are currently proposed.
And I just want to put a
Or
pin in,
questions.
depending on where we put our X's, we may need to come back to item 9, back to SR 915, depending on what we do with these X's.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
No doubt. So, as currently proposed, for short, and remember, we're not talking about homestay at this point. For short-term rental, we are currently, as proposed, proposing to allow them in the Village Commercial District, the Village Mixed Use District, and the Residential Multiple Family District. All these districts do allow mixed uses. The RMF is multiple family is more of a transient use district. So I think, and the VC is more in that village commercial area. So I think the discussion behind that was the STR should at least be appropriate in those particular areas. The other areas, they have not been proposed at this point, so it would be up to Planning and Zoning Board's discussion on what aspects that we might want to make a recommendation to council on.
So just for clarity, we've
Or-
removed basically homestay as well, right? Because I know the initial one has question marks. And so and these are the current proposed as they came from council at this point in time?
That's correct.
Okay, all right. So Hal, let's do this. Let's go ahead and do kind of another round robin and state if you feel an X needs to be placed in another part of that box and give a brief reasoning.
And I'll just make as currently proposed, is not currently proposed to allow the short-term rental use in any of the single-family districts. Sorry, Paul.
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
So I can't remember if I asked this question last time or not. But Village Cottage Professional, what is that? I'm sure everyone knows that answer, but
That's a handful of homes that are located over on, what is that, Community Road in Dundee, I think down Power Plant or Spur Road.
Spur is a alleyway, right? Dirt road?
Well, it's an actual road. It allows, it's mostly single-family uses that are currently located in that area. I think there might be one STR located in that area. I'm trying to find. I'll read from the. I'll read what the intent is, Paul. The intent of the Village Cottage Professional District is intended to provide for limited office and retail development in a wide variety of housing types in pedestrian-scaled residential-styled structures. Permitted uses are by right, are single-family, two-family, multiple-family, townhouses, family care, dwelling mixed-use, bed and breakfast, bank, credit union, financial services, and personal services, and about another 10 other type of.
Okay, so
uses.
kind of mixed use,
Kind of
like
mixed
in the
use.
old days.
Correct,
Okay,
correct.
all right. So I'm good with the way it stands, the question mark for VCP. I mean, I'm okay with that. I guess I think so. I'm answering your question, right? I think the only thing that was brought to my attention last Thursday, which I was kind of surprised with, is I think any community within Pinehurst that has an established HOA should, have their members vote, determine, how they want to STRs permitted in that area or not. It gives them a opportunity to let the members of the board of directors make a decision from their own community. Whereas I think we are making a recommendation, and the council make a decision on areas that aren't governed within Pinehurst. So that would be the only exception that I would add.
All of those are still subject to the same zoning requirements otherwise, though. That's the problem.
That is correct.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, it's words on a paper, you just write it that way,
Well, no,
video.
we can't.
Because then you're say CCNC has R30 and there's other properties outside of CCNC that have R30. You can't allow them in some R30 and not others. And then it's more problematic because then you're allowing a use in some residential single-family zones and not others.
That is correct.
Microphone.
Press it. No, you gotta just press it once, just don't hold it. There you go. Oh, there. Sonia, help her.
It's not.
There you go. She got it.
The council asked us to make a recommendation on that cottage professional, did they not?
Correct, I forgot. In my staff memo, we had talked about, the VCP originally had a question mark on it, so that was a question mark, was whether we should include VCP, so thank you, Paul, for raising that. So that is a specific question as well, should it be included in VCP, so this as well should be part of the discussion.
Include that in our comments as we each respond. Philip?
So Paul, I think you had commented on that, maybe?
Yeah, good to go.
Okay.
And as I mentioned, that's kind of a mixed use. There's already some commercial intertwined in there. Yeah.
I do not have any deviation from my previous standpoint.
Any comment on the VCP?
No, I mean, I think that would be fine as added as well.
Adding it also? Okay, all right. David?
Wait, just to, so you're saying from what when you say previous standpoint, you're saying you're not saying you have no comment on this as it is, you're saying?
No, I think it should continue in the residential areas, not just the multifamily, not just VMU, VC, SR.
So your recommendation would be to provide access throughout all of the residential sections?
Correct,
Okay. Okay.
with permitting and all the other items that we've discussed here tonight, the safety issues, the contact information issues, the fire extinguishers. I mean, all of it together, I think, should come into play as a middle ground, but I've stated that publicly, so I don't need to keep going into it, so.
No, agree.
Paul, did we need to circle back to you on that point at all, what Philip just covered? Because I know we specifically asked about VCP. We didn't talk about some of the things that Philip had just addressed. Do you need to add anything else on that? Or
No,
not?
I would not put another X in the block
Okay.
anywhere.
Okay, I wanted to make
Yep.
sure you got that out there.
Change the question mark to an X, I'm good to go.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, I don't see any issue with the use being permitted by right in VCP. Again, as it is currently permitted, because it's not defined or regulated, I think it should also be permitted by right in every single-family residential zone, subject to special requirements to be defined for, public safety, health care, welfare, all that.
Okay. Thank you. Jack?
Yeah, I think the table as it is fine. It could, permitted by right in residential, multifamily, village mixed use, village commercial. Village cottage, professional, there's only 4 or 5 houses. I know that zoning district was created actually for just one unique situation years and years and years ago. And they're mostly residential, but if you wanted to allow them by right in that village cottage professional, I'd be okay with that VCP. It's a very small impact area, plus hopefully it's going to be part of a wonderful development in Village Place. So that, I would agree with the table as proposed.
One of my concerns with splitting the use this way between the multifamily and the single-family residential is I'm concerned about, and I'm not an economist, I'm not a housing specialist. I'm concerned about, if you think about supply and demand, if they're only allowed in those rental units, I imagine that there will be a serious movement of short-term rentals to those multifamily units. And I imagine if I'm a landlord of a multifamily unit, it's going to be more advantageous to me to not have that as a long-term rental and to make it a short-term rental because there's now a demand for it. There's scarcity. I'm going to raise my prices, and I worry that we're going to price long-term renters out of the most economic housing that's available in Pinehurst. That to me is a real concern. And I think if we're concerned that quality of life is diminished by STRs, we don't seem particularly concerned about diminishing the quality of life of our residents in the multifamily housing areas. In fact, we're going to increase the density of short-term rentals in those neighborhoods. That concerns me. So what I would like to do, my suggestion, since that's all I have to give council, is to go with a vigorous permitting scheme such as we've discussed tonight, and then allow short-term rentals across residential areas. So I'm concurring with Philip and David.
Thank you.
Jules, did you comment on VCP? I would assume.
I would assume that would be fine.
Matt?
So in looking at other municipalities, areas, and trying to find comparable ones, it was interesting reading the article on Chapel Hill, and they said that their council commissioned a task force that took 2 years to look at this issue. And even
We're
what
getting
they've come
close.
up with is still, yeah. And they have, according to that site, about half as many as the numbers that have been shared as are here. So, we've all kind of done our separate research, but to make a leap that changes the table or the uses in these zones so significantly for the amount of time we've had to discuss it, I'm not comfortable to put that in a recommendation. So I would also agree to put X's permit by right in the residential areas as well as the areas shown in the table, because that maintains with a reasonable step what the situation is today, and puts us in a position to see how it goes with these regulations and the village's ability to enforce these special requirements, and make changes as needed.
Thank you.
And VCP?
Oh, yeah, VCP, sorry.
Yep.
You include it. Anya?
I'm going to refer to a letter from Mr. Pashley, or from the mayor, from Mr. Pashley in the discussion. Having lived here and gone through Pinehurst going basically bankrupt, we are kind of going against the resort with us too. And if you noticed in the letter, I don't know if y'all read it or not, about how the one-bedroom condo in Linville Gardens went up to $2,500 a month. The short-term rentals are making long-term rentals more expensive, driving away potential future residents. And I think what Joel said about the housing, that is the whole idea of the STRs, are making homes in the neighborhoods go so exorbitant that a young new family can't buy a house. So I agree with Paul, and I agree with Jack.
So the VCP? Okay, all right. Luis?
Well, I agree with much of what Matt said. And I do know that this is a 2-year study to get something like this done. So this is the quickest, something as important as this is the quickest I've ever heard of anything being done. So I'll say that to start with. And given that,
Just look into
think-
Highlands, and it's not quite that quick, but, yeah. As I look into Highlands, and we're not quite that quick, but
no,
it's
no,
close.
no, no,
Thank you.
you're right. I would, given proper regulations and given proper enforcement, right now, I would say that short-term rentals should be permitted in all residential districts.
Okay, and VCP as well?
Yeah.
VCB? Okay, all right,
And village residential.
okay. Darren, what's our next step?
Do we separate out the table 8.5? Or do we want to handle all the other ones ahead of this and then do it? Or do you, Jules, you wanted to do this all at once, correct? One motion? I think it might be easier if we,
Well, I mean, some things inform other things.
yeah.
You know, because there's no need to touch amortization if the vote of the board, if the motion that comes out of here is such that amortization is not an issue. You know, we don't need to beat that horse if it's not an issue.
It won't come into effect either.
You know, similarly, I have a lot of concerns about non-conforming use regulation, and we haven't talked about that yet. We've only talked about the regulation of permitted units that are in violation. The idea of regulating and fining non-conforming use is a related but separate conversation. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure, Darren.
I'm looking to get a motion from somebody.
But before we get into motions, I mean, I think each of us might be able to articulate our concerns. And some of us have staked out positions, others not so much, but some have. But anyway, I'll stake out mine. And I've been, first of all, just some background. This is not new information here. This study or this problem or this issue goes back, I've been attending council meetings for going on 12 years. And repeatedly, this has been brought up to council that short-term rentals in their neighborhoods are a problem. So this is not anything new, okay? And councils have discussed this ad nauseum. In fact, there was a proposal in 2013 to add an overlay district in the Lake District because there was some very disruptive short-term rental going on at that time. And it was an ordinance proposal that was brought forward and discussed in great length, but dismissed by council at that time. Since that time, of course, as we know, the number of short-term rentals has exploded. And not only has the number exploded, but the ability to access them through Airbnb and VBRO and any number of other new technologies has allowed the ownership of those to be dispersed greatly, and not just local residents and/or local real estate agents. So I think that this is not a new problem. I think it's ingenuous to think that the village council hasn't been talking about this for a long time. They have been, believe me. The second thing I'd like to mention is that, and I heard a number of real estate professionals and so forth argue for the middle ground and so forth. Why don't we find the middle ground? Well, I will tell you that the real estate industry has been spectacularly successful with electing and lobbying our legislatures in North Carolina to enact legislation that has restricted us and given us really very little options. The middle grounds have been taken away. The only option left for municipalities is land use decisions. None of the other registration, permitting, limiting the number, their location to each other, that's all been taken away. by the legislature. So the real estate industry has been spectacularly successful in eliminating our ability to actually find that middle ground. That's my opinion. So I find that a short-term rental is no more than a unregulated transient lodging business that exists within a single-family residential district. That's my opinion. And as such, I find it inappropriate and in many cases incompatible. Yes, a great number, if not the majority of the tenants who come in are wonderful people, and they do that for the right reason, and there's really no problems. But unfortunately, it is in fact an unregulated commercial lodging business for transients within a residential district. So for that reason, I believe it should not be permitted by right in the residential districts.
Can I ask you, why then are you comfortable with having it in the multifamily residential area?
Because it classically has been in the multifamily districts, as a matter of fact. And I think the expectation of the neighborhood is different than it is in single-family residences. I think the expectation when you arrive in a single-family residence neighborhood that it will be, in fact, a single-family residence. I mean, when Diamond Head platted the 5,000 lots in 1971, they put together ordinances and restrictions that apply, by the way, to all those lots, and still do, by the matter of fact, that says the use shall be for residential lodging.
So do we,
It says that right in the declarations and the covenants that apply to all those 5,000 lots.
But
It says so, it's in the deeds.
Is that any different than if I'm, like the townhomes at Lafayette, right there at, on Linden? I mean, I assume the expectation of the people who live there is similar, don't you think? That they're going to have single families living in the townhouses next to them?
One of the differences in townhomes and condominiums is they have normally, in fact, I think almost without exception, they have homeowners associations. And they can, in fact, decide whether or not they want to have long-term rentals or short-term rentals. I was president of a local homeowners association some years ago, and that had a regulation that allowed short-term, rentals up to 6 months. But there was so much problem with some of the 6-month rentals is that they demanded, and we changed the declarations and covenants to restrict it to only 1 year minimum. So every homeowners association can in fact choose how they want their neighborhood to be like. They have the ability, whereas single-family residence neighborhoods do not have that ability.
unless the single-family neighborhoods with HOAs, if they're currently allowing that, then you take that right away from those HOAs that would otherwise permit it. That's problematic, don't you think?
It could be problematic. I assume that the village council and the village will find a way, if in fact that homeowners association wants to in fact allow short-term rentals, they'll find a way to find a solution to that problem. They may.
Let me ask staff a question. Darren?
Yes.
So what subjects have we not discussed tonight that you feel pertinent?
No, I think we've discussed everything with
Right.
respect to, with respect to the ordinance that we need to, I think after our conversation, I'm reading 5 support for, I think you all support some form of the regulation, whether it be the revocation of the development permit, having the SR requirement with possibly some modifications, and the definition. I think you're all on board on that. I think the board is somewhat split, but on the table of permitted uses, but I think there's 5 that have clearly stated that they would support it within, remaining within single-family districts. So I'm trying to think through, your options as a board would be to take a motion and take the entire package that's being proposed, and then make your modifications as proposed, or and I know I'm jumping a little bit.
Okay. It's
The
part of my
second,
discussion
the
with you.
second option would be to go through each of those sections and provide a recommendation on each of those sections, then you can focus on each one at a time versus the entire package, but that will be up to you as the board to consider. But have you covered everything? I think you've covered everything. You've given me a lot of good information. Whether it gets into the actual final, what makes it up to council, there's things that I can still research as it's going to council, and I can provide them that as background material as well.
That's the reason I was asking the question, because my thought process, there's two valuable pieces that we're providing to council. One is our discussion. So if we've discussed all pertinent pieces and you feel that we have done so, then I'm comfortable taking a motion from the board. If you all would start to review your motion packets, I would ask for some sort of orderly discussion, considering the importance of this and how split we not only are as a board, but really a community. And keep in the back of your mind that we're trying to accomplish something and give a true recommendation. So I'm open if someone wants to start having some discussions towards that.
So the section 4 and section 10.2, I feel pretty good there. Was there any opposition with, was that 4-point revocation of development permit? I don't remember anything.
There was,
So as written, I recall that being okay. And same with the definition of short-term rental, other than the 14-day, maybe enforcement issue. So with regard to section 4 and 10.2, can we bifurcate those two?
that would be fun, that, if it's
You're
fine with
asking
the
if
board, it's
there's
fine.
you're asking if there's a consensus above the board to
Yeah,
move those
for
forward.
section 4 and
Pass
section
debate.
10.2.
Anybody object to that? Please review it for a second. Okay, so no, hearing none of that, I think that's what we move forward with doing at this point. Okay, I don't want to put any sort of in motion as considering it's already part of the ordinance.
If you'll entertain a motion for those two?
Would you be willing to do, okay, all right, if that's beneficial to staff and council, then yes, I would be entertaining a motion.
Okay, I move that the Planning and Zoning Board recommend the Pinehurst Village Council approve the proposed amendments to sections 4 and 10.2 as written and
Second.
as presented to us this evening.
It would be section 4.2.12, revocation of development permit as written, and the definition, what is that, 10.2, the addition of short-term rental as proposed, correct?
Yes, correct.
Is there a way?
Matt seconded.
Second.
So as mentioned by Darren is what you are motioning, is that correct?
Correct.
I was just clarifying.
So we got a motion on the floor by David. I think the original second was by Matt. Is that still the case? So motion made by David, second by Matt. I'd like to take a roll call vote tonight. Paul?
I agree.
Aye.
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 That's unanimous. So let's move forward to the next.
I'd like to comment for discussion. And Jack, I appreciate your thoughts. And, you know, the issue of use, is it appropriate in residential areas? I mean, obviously, that's the question. And I went back and forth in my own mind on it. The definition of single-family dwelling was kind of most illuminating to me because, I mean, honestly, before reading it, I obviously, long-term rentals, it's got to be allowed. And because I rented a house for years, and so I'm like, okay, well, so somehow it's in there, and it's in there specifically, the ownership, so that it's not distinct, you know, as I went back and forth on it, I think we're creating a subcategory of that, but I'm at a place, you know, with two pieces. One, I feel like it may not be the purest form of dwelling single family, but it still, to me, seems to fall under that definition. And I think that's worth consideration by council, because I think that the current PDO gives you that ability to look at that and feel like permitting STR, the use of STR in residential areas is is consistent. And then the second, is it just long-term, what will it look like? It would make sense that there would be more regulation and more revision to the table long-term, but for kind of the nature of how we've all done our own research and without a concerted, organized effort, this is as much as I'm comfortable with. So even though it's making a lot of X's in the table, really it's not changing things as much as they are right now. So that's kind of where I landed, but I appreciate your comments.
Yeah, I don't know if this is out of order, but just one more consideration. If it's limited to where it's allowed now, the zones where the condos are, for lack of a better word, if you look at those areas on the zoning map, those are located in highly populated residential zoning districts. The access for all of these communities that are essentially going to be turned into hotels, each, villa area, if everything's going to be pushed there, those residential communities are going to suffer. People complain about traffic. The most important things on the survey were safety, quiet, peaceful setting, and then walkable streets was another one. I'd argue that all of those are stripped, or at least, I figure I have the same evidence that the survey has. I figure all those are impacted by shifting or moving all of the short-term rentals to the perceived permitted zones. So that's another consideration, but otherwise I think I stand with what I've stated already.
I'm a little cautious about forecasting what the future is going to be like, to be honest with you. The arguments about economic Armageddon and so forth, and this will happen and that will happen and all the rest of that, I think are speculative at best. And whether or not the short-term rentals would actually move to all those units is again speculative. There's been an explosive growth in short-term rentals, and I'm not sure how much demand there is for short-term rentals in 1-unit or 2-unit condominiums compared to the apparent insatiable demand for short-term rentals in houses. So, my expectation, if you want to forecast the future, is that the number of short-term rentals if left unchecked, the number of short-term rentals in the residential areas will again double in a couple more years, and the problem will be even worse, in my opinion. So I go back to the fact that these are unregulated businesses providing transient lodging. It's an unregulated business being conducted in a residential zone that is a disruptive business to a great extent. This is not like someone's running a consulting firm out of their den. This is a business where people come and go and have to come and go endlessly every week in a different group. So that, in that respect, it is a disruptive business. That's just my opinion.
That's the great thing about a democracy. You have a vote. If you don't like how those you elected voted, you get rid of them and you run this back again, when we've got 800 short-term rentals. That's what makes this nation great.
Comments? Is anybody working towards a motion?
I'm not prepared to make a motion on the special requirements or even the table of permitted uses, because I think the requirements need to be qualified a little bit further.
I'll make a motion. Can I make a motion? I move to approve with revisions the sections 8.5 and 8.6. 8.5, table of permitted and special uses and special requirements, with uses as noted, adding all residential districts and the VCP district, and to the special requirements on 8.6 as drafted, plus comments. I can't find them.
You looking for Jack's comments on that?
I'm looking for,
Why don't we break those
Yeah,
apart,
and
Matt?
Jules.
I mean, I would
We can.
recommend breaking 8.5, 8.6 apart. I think there was, appeared to be a lot of consensus on 8.6, right?
Okay.
A split on 8.5, so if we break those apart, I think we could probably get this concluded.
That's motion, but I think that's understood, yes. I think
I'm
you're-
willing to modify the motion, but I do think there is still discussion, because we can have discussion once a motion is made, a discussion around the 8.6 related to points 14 and 15. So
Okay.
I'm not clear what, the motion is only related to the table of uses, is that correct?
let me go with that one first. So let me modify the motion. I move to approve with revisions. I move the Planning and Zoning Board recommend the Village Council approve the proposed amendments with following revisions. Section 8.5, Table of Permit and Special Uses and Special Requirements, with the districts as written, adding the residential districts and the VCP districts.
Can I ask you to consider one thing as part of that? Because you're adding all the single family, we also have the neighborhood commercial district, which allows mixed use. We also have the VR district, which allows multiple family
So wherever bed and breakfasts are currently allowed also,
or mixed use.
or mixed use.
So that would include neighborhood commercial, office and professional, VR allows, village residential district allows multiple family townhouses clustered, so VR. And that would be, and VCP, so that would cover the gamut.
Matt, do you mind
I'm just,
stating that as, if that's part of your motion? Clarifying that?
NC, neighborhood commercial, well, it's not currently on the table. If you're already adding it to, if you're adding it to the single, if you're recommending to add it to the single family, I don't know if you're going to do that, but it would make sense to add it to the other couple districts that allow those type of uses.
Understand the point?
Yeah, I was just looking to see if there was something that fit that well to mirror it after.
If you all don't want to do that, that's fine, I'm just raising it as a point. And I'm sorry to have cut in on you on that one,
That's
Matt.
okay.
I didn't want to have to go back.
Neighborhood commercial, office and professional, VCP, VR.
VR.
Yeah, I'm comfortable with that amendment.
Okay, do you
Well,
mind?
I don't want to have to redo this again, so.
Okay,
Let me say it again.
please, Matt.
I move that the Planning and Zoning Board recommend to the Village Council that we approve the proposed amendments with the following revisions. Section 8.5, Table of Permitted and Special Uses and Special Requirements, to include the districts as drafted, plus residential districts, as well as neighborhood commercial, office and professional, village cottage professional, and village residential.
That covers staff's
Yep,
purview.
covers it.
I'll second the motion.
We have a motion on the floor by Matt. We have a second by David. Let's take a roll call vote. Paul?
You not support?
Aye.
Aye.
No, I do not support that.
Aye.
Oh, aye.
No, I do not support.
Aye.
5-3, motion is passed. That leaves,
So Darren, can you give us some guidance then with that understanding? If we look at SR 9, 14 and 15, how is that impacted?
It wouldn't apply.
But neither of them apply.
Well, 9 would, I mean, ERIS. You're talking about 13, 14. Did you say 13, 14? No, 14 and 15.
14.
I said 14 and 15.
Yeah, I heard 9.
We still have, there are some districts that we did not mark.
Yeah, there are some districts that are not included, but they don't have housing, you're saying, so it's not an issue.
Not an issue.
Okay, so 14 falls away. 15 falls away.
I wouldn't say it falls away because, once again,
Okay, go ahead.
you're an advisory board. There's still going to be another step in this
Oh,
process.
yeah, right. So we have to, assuming that, we ought to discuss it, assuming that the council feels differently than our motion, we ought to take a look at that and see if we want to advise council on how they want to handle, thank you.
But
Because
wouldn't
if
that
it
be-
doesn't apply.
No, exactly, you're right.
But how would 14 be any different then?
Then 14 and 15 are, well, hold on, let me talk amongst yourself quick.
So we have completed the motions through each of the 4 sections, but what I'm hearing is there may be some concern for 14 and 15, is that correct?
14.
As
four-
we've advised at this point.
14 would mean that everybody comes into compliance with SR 9 by a certain date. So that's what it applies to. Anybody who's operating, so after the establishment, if this gets passed, you're going to have to get a development permit. You're going to have to come into compliance with SR 9 as written.
So what I'm wondering on this is if it needs to be a tighter window than with what we've already had a motion for, if for existing short-term rentals that we're recommending to remain, if a year and a half is excessive.
I would prefer not. I mean, now this is where we are starting to get into an enforcement issue because now all those permits are going to be coming in and we're going to have to be reviewing for those. So I think that window from our perspective is fine because the window is there. You're already operating, you have to get there for the existing non-conforming. Everybody else after the effective date of this ordinance would have to apply right away. So I don't have an issue with that
Okay.
timeframe.
Okay, so shall we look at 15, the amortization period, assuming that, if council goes ahead and implements, are we comfortable with the amortization schedule?
Proposing that we make an alternate recommendation to council.
No, I'm not so much proposing I don't know exactly what I'm proposing.
we're
I'm
revising.
wondering if we want to, if our task from council is to give them advice on this proposal, do we want to give them advice on this proposal? Or do we not? That's my question.
Yeah, I mean, assuming that, the council doesn't go with how this board aligned, I mean, I think 3 years is enough for someone to adjust their
That was
business practices.
supported, that was even the longer breakdown from what was presented in the previous meeting, from what I remember. It was like 2.2, so the
Well,
3 years was on
October,
the
23,
longer
The 3 years.
25.
It
3
does seem
years.
inconsistent to me, though, to have a motion that has been approved, but then to make a caveat in a separate motion about that.
I don't even know that it's
Well, no, yeah, I don't think it's separate. I
It's just
mean,
you-
we're
you
just
leave it and it
looking at the
applies.
text.
But we haven't had a motion on 8.6 yet, so it is still a separate motion.
Correct.
So.
You're
if we
talking
na-
about it right now.
I guess it depends on who makes
Yeah.
the motion.
Yeah, sure. That's
Is-
true.
But we still had to get, because Jules' concern was with the municipal code hammering up 153 and
Right. I do wonder if that's what we want for 13A. If we do want that to reference the entire PDO, which is, I believe, what it's doing right now, correct, Darren?
That is correct.
Or do we want to carve out section, 92.01 of the municipal code? Or do we want to bring in sections of the PDO? I don't know.
That will be another meeting, likely.
Well, if we recommend it as is, what we're saying is that staff, we're leaving the responsibility up to them to do that prior to the village council. We're not necessarily saying this is exactly what you take to them, because they can.
Point.
You could make a recommendation, that could be added to your recommendation to further define 13A, potentially, something. words as to that effect. Rather than coming up with that tonight.
Yeah, that's,
Right.
Well, and we're starting to get to where we were on Thursday, where we spent a lot of time talking about what we were going to do. If we think the task to go ahead and redo the wording is too mammoth for this evening, I think we've got a lot of, accomplishments done today. And maybe you come back on the 15th on that work session that was already there. And then all you got to do is isolate this problem here. Or we just buckle down and knock this thing out tonight. I'm good either way.
Considering we've been here for 3 hours, it's definitely not outside of our range of expectation of a meeting window. And so I think that's a concern. But I also understand that some board members have some other issues that may hinder their long-term setting here, so.
I mean, for discussion, I'm comfortable with the list as it is and trusting staff to make updates to make it more
Yeah,
specific.
I would
for the
tend to agree
safety
with
I
you.
agree.
requirements as discussed here
Right.
that were, yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
addressed.
I would tend to agree with Matt. I mean, the list is comprehensive. It references everything it needs.
Yeah, I mean, if it works, if it's all right for the purposes of a motion, Darren, to say, to reference the general discussion and then put it at staff's discretion, that seems pretty loosey-goosey to me. But, I'm cool with it, but it seems,
Very clear on a lot of our discussion, and you've made those points as well as for a discussion standpoint, right? Or are we still wavering on some of that?
oh, no, I feel like I've said what I need to say, and I like Jack's I think Jack added a lot to shoring up these permits and making them work for the renter as well as the community. I know we had a question about that 1 hour thing. I know I've got a question about what part of the code. I've got a question about defining large gathering. We can either grind that out or not.
Or we could just ask the staff to give the council the notes on what we have discussed and what our feelings are on the different things. I think that would make more sense than rehashing it all again.
I do think that there's two portions of value that we provide to council, and our discussion is one of them, and I'm sure most of them review the
Right.
video.
So I think that's, compromise.
Are there any,
Clear.
I mean, are there specific changes to any of the numbers that you want to recommend? So if somebody's going to make a motion on adopting SR 9, I want to approve it with the following recommendations. You can make a specific recommendation as to what you want to do with the number. You want to recommend that it be further clarified for section 13A, that council consider.
Could be that type of motion as well. You're correct. Yeah,
And
definitely.
that's what I'm trying to get to.
Right. So as well, I think that what's important to note is we're not trying to push this thing forward, nor are we trying to slow it down. So
Yeah, and I think,
Jack, do you want to try to do a motion since you've got,
No, I don't quite understand the
I think what Jules was getting at was that she thought, I'm not speaking for Jules, that 13A is very broad. And
As
it
far
would-
as what could be a violation.
Correct. And that potentially opens you up for, like,
Somebody doesn't
any
like your
potential
board.
violation of the PDO, not that would open it up for potential revocation.
So
Not
could
that that
we-
can't be appealed, but yes, you're right.
So our motion, our recommendation could be a more specific wording or definition towards 13A? We can actually pinpoint which section that we
to
prefer?
pinpoint all of those sections would require me to sit down, or require us to sit down and go through the PDO with a fine-tooth comb right now. Nobody wants to
yeah,
do that.
but when it says any Pinehurst Development Ordinance, okay, when it says that, whether it's an STR, long-term rental, your own house, you're already in compliance with that.
Right.
I mean, it's an inherent task. It almost could be removed.
But
But, you know what I mean? It's, I would leave it, but this is an inherent task. That's why you have the PDO. So I don't think you need any more specificity on that, on that
The
point.
fear there is you're considering violations of the PDO that aren't tied to the, I guess, the specific.
Then you're not
short-term.
violating it. You know what I mean?
Well, but if this is tied to a special requirement for short-term rentals, then the special requirement needs to be related to the short-term rental.
Yeah, but it's still residence, though, you know what I mean? So it's going to still fall under that umbrella, though, I think. You hear what I'm saying?
I see what you're saying.
Yeah, short-term, long-term, vacant home, you're still going to have to follow.
Can I clarify just
Yeah.
one part? It's in 13, it says, "The development permit may be revoked." It doesn't say shall. So there, again, there would be, when it says may, that becomes an administrative interpretation of the PDO. So so that adds, again, that brings back into play potentially the Board of Adjustment. So it's a may, not a shall. So that's why, I think that's why we put it in there. That was.
Yeah, and I think
that was
that-
the-
Satisfy you or at all?
Well, now I have to think.
No, you have to think, I'm sorry. No, it's-
And you kind of look at 9 as an example. Look at line 9. Every dwelling, unit shall be provided with adequate means of egress, and it goes on. I mean, that's all the stuff that kind of Jack talked about. I mean, that's all code. That's, we can continue to add more detail if we want, but I think it's already going to be covered in multiple state, county, municipality.
It's covered in chapter 153. Again, this is the assistance to when we start to develop the permit and somebody's looking at, well, what are the requirements? Getting to the whole posting thing that we're talking about. These are some of those basic requirements that somebody who's looking to create an STR or looking at some of the regulations, they're pulling up these specific development regulations. So we felt it necessary.
That use of the may does a lot to make me more comfortable with the way, as it is written. Yeah, that's, E, I can give you language.
Yes, please.
Okay.
Yeah, you keeping track of this,
And y'all
please?
read along with me to see if this is what you agree with, please. A verified violation is a determination by a code enforcement official, law enforcement officer, or judge, period. Following such determination, comma, notice of a violation shall be issued by the village, period. And then it's fine from there on in.
Following such a determination,
Following such a determination, comma,
oh, okay.
notice of a violation, scratch being, add shall be, issued by the village. If that works for everyone, I think that's a little less circular.
Yeah, sounds good.
Matt, can we get your input on that?
Yes, I'm comfortable.
That satisfies everybody, and anybody's comfortable moving with the motion in that, I would accept it.
The only other one that I'd put out there is in 12. For special events, making it capital S, capital E, or referencing back to the PDO. And if you're going to use that word large gathering, I think you need to know what that means.
I don't disagree.
Agree.
Back to Darren, what do you want to do with that word?
Add that in.
We don't want
one's
to put a
already
number on
defined.
large gatherings, do we?
If one of them's already defined, go with that definition.
You can just capitalize special event,
Yeah.
reference the PDO, and scratch large gathering,
And then define.
if that's
large.
cool with everyone. Unless you
Right.
guys want to leave in large gathering to be determined by the village planner. But that seems, I don't know if that's what you want.
I don't mind special events.
Scratch.
I mean, we can always modify in between here and there, and we can do that. So if that's a recommendation, I'm fine with that recommendation.
And the other was that Jack made was to post, basically record of these requirements shall be posted in the,
Well, you can do that by just adding to the recommendation that some additional provision should be made relative to tenant notification on rules, regulations, and contact information. Just leave it at that, and let you work that out in an application form that says, in the application
Development
for the development permit, it says you should do these kinds of things to the tenant.
That will be
and
on-
You can
I
do that.
agree.
But you want them posted, you still want everything posted.
Yeah,
I think.
and I think we need to include the additional safety requirements that you posited.
100%.
Yeah, well, I was just recommending that numbers 4 and 5 be a little bit more robust relative to the statement of maintenance and operability of the various fire safety apparatus. And you could just leave it at that.
That means shall maintain fully operable and building and fire code compliant smoke and carbon monoxide detectors in the short-term rental property.
If you're okay with that.
I'm fine with it, just, and the fire extinguisher.
Rather than just say a smoke detector should be provided, it's like, what do you mean? It's unopened box of, okay, here it is, here's your smoke detector.
Installed and
Not the intent, but.
As
not the
someone
intent.
kept up with those lists, I was trying to till the end. So let's review our list here real quick. So the first one was we'll just come say the grammatics and the verbiage as stated by Julia originally, right?
Following such determination, that one on number
Yeah, that was for 13E.
13E.
E.
Shannon, we have that language, right?
And then what was the next one? The next one was
Special events,
special
So we
events
were
being
gonna-
capitalized and remove large gatherings.
correct.
And then the next one was addition of signage as well as, help me,
I think it was prominent posting of
Applicable.
rules and regulations, contact information.
Village and tenant rules and regulations and contact information.
okay?
I think that's sufficient.
We can,
Had something
work
about a
that
fire
out.
extinguisher.
I had it, and then I was typing what you said before. Sorry, I had it, but then I was typing while you were saying the last one.
Which one do you want to do? Which one do you
The
need?
one on the posted,
Posting the
or
rules.
how we're going to.
Take that again. Jack, do you mind saying that again? Sorry to have you do it again.
Some additional requirements should be added relative to tenant contact information and village rules, regulations, and expected ordinance compliance, such as garbage,
Yeah,
street
posting-
parking, et
posting-
cetera, et cetera.
yeah,
Anything
that's
else?
general enough.
You can
General
get carried
instructions.
away with that information.
We got it.
Matt, is that enough for you? Anything else? Do we have any safety requirements or anything that I hear, or are we where we are?
I mean, I think just following general building code, I mean, that kind of goes without saying, but I think safety is
All in
going to be
there.
important. I haven't said much tonight. I'm exhausted, but I think you don't want to hear somebody cutting out, support walls in a house to add an extra bedroom. So I think we need to make sure that referencing building code, which you've done, is covered.
That's also the other rules that we've talked about, the STR, the contact information. Just have that, it's not uncommon. We can put some flesh on that.
So are these rules and regulations as far as obtaining a development permit? In other words, a short-term rental development permit still applicable? Okay, because the 2 adults per bedroom, I did a little research on all the short-term rentals, at least the 137 I could find, in one particular period over VBRB, and the average advertised ratio of sleeping to bedrooms is well in the high 2s. In other words, they don't advertise 2 people per bedroom. They advertise,
And if they get caught, that'll be a violation.
And we have.
well, the question is, in the application for the development permit, how will that be specified?
They'll specify, they'll show us they'll show us bedrooms on a floor plan, and then we'll base the capacity, we'll put a capacity on the development permit saying, you know,
And
it's,
the development permit will say the occupancy, but is it also talked about how you can promote and/or advertise the unit?
because then you start to get into other issues that we don't
Okay,
want.
so we can continue to advertise 3 bedrooms, sleeps 12.
And then it comes to enforcement.
Comes to enforcement, and we have enforced, I can tell you, we have enforced on that. We've been, not particularly, on that, we've enforced some STRs where they're advertising a bedroom that didn't meet a bedroom requirement. It didn't have windows, didn't have any. We saw that online and we contacted the person, so it's not like we don't look for those things. So it's something that we do look at, and people, you know, naturally, people around here, there's going to be some reports.
I can tell you it's going to be the exception rather than rule to see someone advertising sleeps the same, 2 per bedroom.
Well, you know, I hope it'll be a new day for Pinehurst STRs once the enforcement mechanism's in place. I mean,
They'll become unprofitable and they'll disappear and be turned back into
who
full-time residents.
knows? Who knows?
But I think it's okay to say that as a citizen of this community, and I know I'm not, the expectation that we uphold all of our ordinances in a strict manner, I mean, as strict as possible. I mean, I think there's a certain expectation of us as community members. It's not just shared by me. And so I think that feeling's going to be there, pretty broad.
We will enforce. We'll get
Make a
reported,
motion.
we will enforce.
I move the Planning and Zoning Board recommend the Pinehurst Village Council approve the proposed amendment with following revisions. Section 8.6, special requirements to the table of permitted and special uses and special requirements as written with the following revisions. In item 12, capitalize special events and remove or large gatherings. In item 13E, change the first sentence to read, a verified violation is a determination made by a code enforcement official, law enforcement officer, or a judge, period. Following such determination, notice of violation shall be issued by the village, period. Rest to remain as is. And to add 16, contact information and these special requirements shall be posted or otherwise available to tenants.
On the floor, if there's no discussion, or a second?
May I just add conspicuously posted to Matt's last number 16?
Fine, conspicuously posted.
Look up conspicuously. I think that one's defined.
I'm joking.
Yep, I'm comfortable with that.
Comfortable with that? Okay, so we have a motion on the floor now.
Second?
We have a motion by Matt, second by David. Any discussion?
So this does not in any way, shape, or form relate to table of uses or
Yep.
all essentially relates to what you need to do to get the development permit. Is that correct?
There's what you need to do to get the development permit, how you can, how you're regulated. It does have we talked about the compliance period, we talked about the amortization. Amortization, if it goes through
I don't
as proposed.
understand the reason for the amortization paragraph.
I think it was an example.
If you're
that
going
other-
to allow them everywhere, I mean, what's the point of having amortization?
Well, again, we separated those, we were just looking at the verbiage here.
It's just leaving it just in case
Correct.
council moves forward without because if we remove it and they decide to, then.
Yeah, okay, it's a good backup. I understand.
Did Matt's motion include Jack's language about the fire?
I think that was 16.
Yeah, dude.
It did, Matt?
Well, it did on posting the information. I didn't
You
say
didn't
anything about-
include
Site and
the
operational.
the operating fire.
Posting the rules and operating with the fire.
Yeah, he got the posting the rules, but not the fire extinguisher and can we,
Would you like to amend your motion, Matt?
I would like to amend my motion.
thank you.
Discussion?
Yeah, based on the discussion, to add
Okay. Second, or maybe,
To
oh, I'm sorry.
to add the requirement for providing a smoke detector and a path of, or egress plan.
Working smoke detector.
I'm sorry, I meant to say fire extinguisher and a egress plan. Yep.
Right through.
Amend the motion. Well, pause. Darren, is this best to be added to 4 and 5, or does this need to be another number?
Well, we could make 4 and 5 a minimum of one shall maintain and operate one fully operable smoke detector, right? One fully operated smoke detector, you go down for 4. Then you go down to 5, minimum of one fully operable carbon monoxide detector shall be provided per level or 4 of the dwelling unit.
Adding one, but my question, I guess, is on the fire extinguisher.
Add it to number 4.
Okay, thank
Add it to the end of 4.
you. Propose to modify the amendment to include adding to number 4 and one fully operable fire extinguisher per rental unit.
One fully operational.
Add me at I move.
Matt, let's take a second. Do you mind typing it out fully and rereading it? Say what,
Yeah, okay.
for procedure, do you mind,
I don't mind. I move the Planning and Zoning Board recommend the Pinehurst Village Council approve the proposed amendment with the following revisions. Section 8.6, special requirements table to the table of permitted and special uses and special requirements as written with the following revisions. Item 4, add and one fully operational fire extinguisher. Item 12, capitalize special events and remove or large gatherings. Item 13E, modify the first sentence to read, "A verified violation is a determination made by a code enforcement official, law enforcement officer, or a judge, period. Following such determination, notice of violation shall be issued by the village, period." The rest can remain as is. And add 16, contact information and these special requirements shall be conspicuously posted or otherwise made available to tenants.
motion on the floor?
Second.
We have a motion on the floor by Matt, seconded by Sonia. Let's do a roll call vote. Paul?
Aye.
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 That's unanimous. Motion passes. Before we step, we still have one more motion to consider. We have not adopted a consistency statement for tonight. Can someone review and please read the consistency statement? Yes.
We can apply it, I would apply it, make it part of the motion that you're going to apply it to all
Good point.
actions.
Okay. So I would ask that whoever makes the motion states that.
Before the motion is made, I would argue that much of the 3 of the 4 motions, or 4 of the 5, if we include the relative to the previous motion made the other night, are consistent. One, I will have to vote when we get to the voting that it is not consistent, and therefore, if it applies to all of them, I'm going to have to vote not consistent.
Do we separate?
So would we like to separate the consistency statements into 4 separate consistency statements?
If it's important to folks, you can change it. Otherwise, you lump
So
them
I'm going to let
together.
Jack make that motion.
Yes.
I'm going to suggest that if we do follow that plan, then with the language to 8.6, which I think is the chart, 8.5, thank you, which I think is the chart, we also add to the consistency statement the guiding principle number 5 from our comprehensive plan.
What is that?
Support the golf tourism and healthcare industries.
Thank you. I should know that, but late.
What I'm hearing is the plan for let's do 4 separate consistency statements. Is that what I'm hearing, correct? Or 1, inclusive?
You can lump them.
One.
Whoever's making the motion.
I make a motion, Chair.
Accept the motion, please.
I move the Planning and Zoning Board adopt the statement of consistency and authorize its chair to execute the documents as the proposed text amendments as contained in the approved motions are consistent with the Village of Pinehurst 2019 Comprehensive Plan. Achieving goals in accordance with the comprehensive plan are considered reasonable and are in the best interest of the public.
We have a motion on the floor by Matt,
Second.
seconded by David. Any discussion? Hearing no discussion, let's do another roll call vote. Paul?
Aye.
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 Fortunately, I think there's one section that is not consistent, so I will have to vote no.
Aye.
Aye.
Jack, no.
Aye.
All right, so 6-2, the motion carries. Have we accomplished our duties?
Yes. You've
Thank
done- you've
everybody.
gone above and beyond.
Okay, so thank you all. So I'll also accept the motion to conclude our meeting.
Are we sure we don't want to consider the definition of homestay tonight?
I'm leaving.
We've already made the motion, I
Okay.
think.
I make a motion that we,
Well, before we adjourn, can I clarify, are we meeting again next week?
The
Do
15th?
homestay, or are we doing form-based codes, or are we, I just want to clarify what we're doing.
Well, my intention was to do form-based codes, but
Seems like we need to do that more.
No, I'm fine with that. I was
Can
just
we ask when
clarifying where
you
we
are
were
planning
at.
on bringing this to council?
it would be next month because we would have to do all the notifications. We have to do the required notifications.
Okay,
So, and I haven't talked about that with administration yet either.
understand that. So as we currently stand, we're meeting on the 15th. I think the agenda will be determined by staff, and I know we've left open the homestay discussion. So if you guys want to discuss that, I mean, not the whole, turning the 15th meeting into the homestay is what I'm hearing, then if there's
I
any
don't
feeling
see
on
the
that.
urgency in the homestay,
Yeah, that's what I'm asking, really.
honest with you.
agreed.
Wow.
I think we need to see how this whole thing
Okay.
plays out over the next couple of months and then figure out what we're going to do on homestays, if anything.
I agree with you, Jack.
All right, so the 15th at this point in time, I think the board's request is to go ahead and move forward with what you previously had planned for that.
Correct. Okay.
All right, so does that clarify everything for everybody? Thank you all.
Thank you all.
I think a
Thank
thank you is certainly,
I'll make a motion to adjourn tonight's meeting.
I'll
again.
second.
and motion made by David, a second by Julia. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Hearing none, we are adjourned.